Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Horror Halloween. Now I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. It was supposed to be a quiet summer vacation. My family and I were visiting my aunt's house out in the country, far from the busy city. The house was old, creaky floors, rusty pipes, and a thick smell of dust in the air. But it was peaceful, and I looked forward to spending time there. Little did I know that what started as a relaxing trip would quickly turn into something out of a nightmare. The trouble began one evening when my cousin Claire, who was only a few months younger than me, started acting strange. At first, it was just small things. She seemed tired, more than usual, and complained about a headache that wouldn't go away. We thought maybe she was just exhausted from all the excitement of being away from home. But then things started to get weirder. Claire started talking in her sleep, but not in the way you might expect. She would mutter strange, garbled words no one in our family had ever heard before. At first, I thought it was just her talking nonsense in her sleep, but then it got worse. She began to say things about her family, things no one could have known. She would whisper things like, "I'll take them all, one by one, and they won't be safe for long." Her voice, though, didn't sound like her own. It was deeper, raspier, almost like someone, or something, else was speaking through her. The first night I noticed it, I brushed it off as just a weird coincidence. But when it happened again the next night, I felt a strange chill creep up my spine. I tried to wake her up, but when I shook her, she didn't respond. Her eyes were open, but they were empty, wide and unblinking, like she wasn't really there. When I called her name, her lips twisted into a grin, but it wasn't Claire's grin. It was wrong. It sent a shock of fear straight to my chest. I ran to tell my parents, but when we all rushed back into her room, she was fine. Claire was sitting up in bed, looking at us like we were crazy. She had no memory of what happened, and she laughed it off. But I wasn't laughing. Something about that smile still haunted me. Days passed, and Claire's behavior grew more erratic. She started doing things she never would have done before. Speaking in strange languages, breaking things around the house for no reason, and even staring at me for minutes at a time, like she could see right through me. My aunt was starting to get worried. She took Claire to a doctor, but the doctor said there was nothing physically wrong with her. He suggested stress, maybe just the pressure of school or something. But I knew it wasn't stress. I didn't have the words to explain it at the time, but something was very wrong. I wasn't the only one who felt it. My uncle, who was usually the calmest person in the room, looked pale every time he entered the house. He wouldn't go into Claire's room anymore, and he would avoid being alone with her. One night, after dinner, he came to me and said something I'll never forget. "I think she's been possessed." I thought he was joking at first, but the look on his face was serious, grave, even. I didn't believe him. I mean, possessions? That's something out of the movies, right? But deep down, I had started to wonder if there was some truth to it. After all, no one could explain the things Claire had been doing. That night, as I lay in bed, I could hear Claire moving around in her room, dragging something across the floor. It wasn't the normal sounds of a restless sleeper. It was almost like scratching, like something was trying to get out. My heart raced, and I finally decided I couldn't just stay there in my room, pretending nothing was happening. I crept down the hallway to her room. The door was slightly open, and a faint light flickered inside. When I stepped inside, my breath caught in my throat. Claire was sitting in the middle of the floor, her back to me, facing the corner. But her head was turned around, completely around, looking at me with those same black, empty eyes. Her mouth hung open, and in a voice that wasn't hers, she whispered, "Leave now, or you will never leave." I froze. My legs turned to stone, and I couldn't move. But something inside me told me to run. So, I did. I sprinted back to my room and locked the door behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest as I sat there, unable to make sense of what I had just witnessed. The next morning, things took a darker turn. My aunt and uncle finally admitted that they had been considering something drastic. They were afraid for Claire, but they didn't know where to turn. That's when my uncle brought up the idea of an exorcism. He had heard about an old priest who lived nearby, someone who had helped people in similar situations. The thought of an exorcism scared me beyond belief, but at that point, I knew something had to be done. The priest, Father Thomas, arrived at the house that afternoon. He was a man in his late 50s, with deep lines on his face and a tired look in his eyes. I could tell he had seen things that no one should have to see. He didn't say much at first, but when he met Claire, I could see him tense up. He knew. He could feel it too. Father Thomas began his prayers, his voice steady and calm. The atmosphere in the room grew colder by the second, and I could hear the faint sound of something scraping along the walls. Claire, who had been sitting quietly, suddenly shrieked, loud, sharp, like a wild animal. Her body jerked violently, and she screamed again. But this time, the voice wasn't Claire's. It was guttural, low, filled with hatred. "You cannot save her," the voice hissed. "She belongs to me now." Father Thomas didn't flinch. He continued his prayers, louder now, as the room filled with an oppressive darkness. I could feel something pressing against my chest, like the air itself was thickening. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't. Something held me in place. Suddenly, Claire's body jerked again, this time with such force that I thought she might break in half. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and the room shook as if there was an earthquake. It was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. Father Thomas shouted something in Latin, and the temperature in the room dropped to an unbearable cold. I could see my breath, even though it was summer outside. Claire's body went limp, and for a moment, I thought it was over. But then she sat up, her face twisted in an expression of pure rage. "Begone, demon!" Father Thomas commanded. With that, Claire collapsed to the floor, and the room fell silent. The cold lifted, and the oppressive feeling slowly faded. Claire's eyes fluttered open, and she looked around in confusion. What happened?" she asked, her voice soft and weak. It was over. The demon was gone. It took days for Claire to fully recover, but she was herself again, calm, kind, and normal. There were no more strange voices, no more terrifying outbursts. But the memory of what I saw that night will never leave me. I don't know what happened to Claire or how it came to be, but I will never forget the feeling of standing there in that room, facing something that wasn't human. Sometimes I still think about that night, and I wonder if I'll ever fully understand what happened. Was it really possession, or was it something else? All I know is that when darkness descends, it can come from the most unexpected places, and sometimes it's up to those with the courage to stand against it, no matter how terrifying it may be. It was the summer of my senior year, and my friends and I decided to spend a weekend at an old, abandoned house on the outskirts of town. Everyone had heard the stories about the Ashford house. It was said to be haunted, with tales of strange occurrences going back generations. People claimed that the house was cursed, that anyone who stayed there was doomed to experience something terrifying. But, of course, being teenagers, we didn't believe in ghost stories. We thought it would be the perfect place to prove we were brave, and maybe even scare each other with a few silly pranks. The house was massive, 3 stories tall with cracked windows and a sagging roof. It looked like something straight out of a horror movie. As soon as we pulled up, I felt a strange sense of unease wash over me. The house looked even worse up close than it did in the stories. The once grand front door was warped, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. We hesitated for a moment, but then laughed it off. It was just an old house, nothing more. The first night was uneventful. We explored the dusty rooms, laughed, and made jokes about the ghosts that supposedly haunted the place. But when we settled down to sleep, things began to feel off. There was a heavy stillness in the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching us. My friend, Jake, who was always the boldest of us, joked about the ghosts and dared anyone to sleep alone in the attic. I think the dare was meant to lighten the mood, but for some reason, I couldn't bring myself to go anywhere near the attic. The next morning, things began to change. It started with Sarah, one of our quieter friends. We woke up to find her sitting by the window, staring out into the dark yard, her eyes wide and unblinking. When we tried to talk to her, she didn't respond. We thought she might be sleepwalking, but that wasn't it. There was something in her expression, something vacant, almost hollow. When she finally spoke, her voice didn't sound like her own. It was deep and raspy, as if someone, or something, was speaking through her. "I can hear them," Sarah whispered, her gaze still fixed on the yard. "They're waiting. They want us." We tried to laugh it off, thinking it was just a prank, or that she was playing along with Jake's dare from the night before. But as the hours passed, things got stranger. Sarah didn't eat. She didn't speak unless it was in that deep, unsettling voice. And when we tried to get her to leave the room, she refused, her body growing rigid and unyielding. That night, the situation escalated. I woke up to the sound of Sarah's voice, low and guttural, like something was whispering in the dark. When I opened my eyes, I saw her standing in the middle of the room. Her back was arched unnaturally, and her eyes were rolled back in her head, showing nothing but white. I froze, too scared to move, too terrified to make a sound. She began to mutter something in a language I didn't understand. It wasn't English, and it certainly wasn't anything we had ever heard before. It was chilling, unnerving. "Leave, before it's too late." That was all she said before her body collapsed back onto the bed. But she wasn't the same after that. Her eyes would flash open randomly, and she would start speaking in that strange, terrifying voice. It didn't seem like Sarah anymore. She seemed different. Her actions grew more violent. She would lash out at us when we tried to help, and sometimes she would just stare at us with that awful, cold gaze. We realized something was wrong, really wrong. This wasn't just a weird prank or an illness. This was something more. And as much as we hated to admit it, the old stories about the Ashford house started to seem a lot more believable. Desperate, we decided to call someone, anyone, who could help. None of us knew much about exorcisms, but we had all heard about a priest in the next town over who had helped a family with a similar situation years ago. I don't know why we thought it would help, but it was our last hope. Father O'Donnell arrived late the next evening. He was an older man, with a stern face but a kind presence. As soon as he stepped into the house, he didn't need any explanation. He knew. He could feel the darkness that lingered in the air. The air itself seemed heavy, thick with something malevolent. "I've seen this before," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "This is no illness, no mere trick. She's been possessed." I felt a chill run down my spine as he said the words aloud. Possession. It seemed impossible, but everything we had seen, everything Sarah had done, told us otherwise. Father O'Donnell didn't waste any time. He told us to stay out of the room and began preparing for the exorcism. As he set up his altar with candles, holy water, and relics, the rest of us huddled together, whispering in fear. We could hear Sarah's voice coming from the room, chanting in that dark language, her voice echoing through the house. It was impossible to tell where she was, or what she had become, but we knew one thing for sure. She wasn't Sarah anymore. The exorcism began just after midnight. We stood in the hallway, waiting. The air grew colder, and the house seemed to groan under some unseen weight. I thought I heard the sounds of footsteps behind me, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. It was like the house itself was alive, aware of what was happening. Inside the room, Father O'Donnell's voice rose in intensity. He spoke in Latin, reciting the prayers of exorcism. I heard Sarah scream from the other side of the door, but it wasn't a scream of pain. It was a scream of rage, like an animal in its final moments. Then, the door burst open. We rushed inside, our eyes widening in terror. Sarah was lying on the bed, her body contorted in impossible angles. Her eyes were completely black, and her mouth was stretched into a grotesque smile. She laughed, a deep, mocking laugh that sent shivers down my spine. "You think you can save her?" the voice from Sarah's mouth mocked. "She's mine now, forever." Father O'Donnell didn't falter. He continued the prayers, his voice unwavering. But Sarah's body began to writhe, her limbs jerking violently as if trying to escape her own skin. The house seemed to shake, the walls groaning under the pressure. The temperature in the room plummeted, and I could see my breath in the air. "Begone, demon!" Father O'Donnell shouted, his voice booming with authority. "In the name of Christ, I command you to leave this body." The room was filled with a terrible, guttural growl. It seemed to come from every direction at once. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and twist, reaching out toward Sarah. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. Sarah's body went limp, and the oppressive presence in the room vanished. The air felt lighter, almost peaceful. For a moment, no one moved. We all stood there, in stunned silence, unsure of what had just happened. When Sarah woke up, she was herself again. Her eyes were clear, and she seemed confused but calm. She had no memory of the events that had occurred, no memory of the demon that had taken control of her body. She only remembered waking up in a room full of people, the faint smell of incense in the air. But I knew what had happened. We all did. The Ashford house was never the same after that night. No one ever spoke about it again, and we all went our separate ways. But I'll never forget what I saw in that house, what I felt, what I experienced. The darkness that had clung to Sarah, the demon that had taken hold of her. It was real. And sometimes, I wonder if we really got rid of it, or if it's still waiting for its next victim. And so, if you ever find yourself in an old, abandoned house, especially one with a history as dark as the Ashford house, remember this. Some things are better left alone. Some things are best left undisturbed. Because once darkness has a hold of you, it's not so easy to escape. It's hard to forget the things you've seen, especially when those things aren't supposed to be real. I used to think the stories about demons and possessions were just that, stories. My name is David, and up until that fateful summer, I had lived a pretty normal life. No ghosts, no monsters, nothing out of the ordinary. That all changed when my family moved into a house in a small town called Oakwood. We weren't expecting much when we moved there. My parents were looking for a fresh start after some personal struggles, and this house seemed perfect. It was a large Victorian-style home, built in the late 1800s, with tall windows and an ivy-covered facade. The kind of house you'd see in movies. It was old, but we liked it. My sister Rachel, who was 15, and I were both excited to have our own rooms and a bigger backyard to explore. The house was located on the outskirts of town, away from everything. The neighbors were few and far between, and the woods behind the house seemed to stretch on forever. We didn't mind. In fact, we loved the peace and quiet. At least, at first. It didn't take long for things to start feeling off. It started with Rachel. She's always been a little shy, but in the weeks after we moved in, she started acting differently. She would sit alone in her room for hours, staring out the window, not speaking much. It wasn't like her at all. I tried talking to her, but she'd always brush me off. "I'm fine," she'd say, but her voice always sounded strange, almost hollow. One night, I came home from hanging out with friends and noticed something odd. Rachel's bedroom door was cracked open, and I could hear her talking. At first, I thought she was on the phone, but then I realized something was wrong. The voice wasn't Rachel's. It was deep, low and rough, like something trying to force its way out of her throat. I hesitated at the door, listening, trying to make sense of it. I could hear her whispering in what sounded like a language I couldn't understand. Then, the voice, not hers, spoke clearly. "They will all fall." My heart skipped a beat. I pushed the door open, and Rachel was sitting in the middle of the room, her back to me. Her head was turned slightly, as if she could feel my presence, but she didn't acknowledge me. When I called her name, her body jerked. Her head snapped around to face me, her eyes wide open but completely vacant. There was nothing behind them. No recognition, no emotion, just emptiness. "I'll take them all," the voice said again. This time, it sounded like it was coming from within her, but not from her. It was like it was being spoken through her, from deep inside her soul. I felt a chill run down my spine. I backed out of the room quickly and ran downstairs to find my parents. I was scared, but I didn't know how to explain what I'd just heard. They weren't home. They had gone out for a dinner with some friends, leaving Rachel and me alone in the house. I didn't know what to do, so I waited. When my parents returned, I told them what had happened. They didn't believe me at first. They thought it was just my overactive imagination or some strange prank Rachel was playing. But things didn't improve. In fact, they got worse. Over the next few days, Rachel became even more withdrawn. She stopped eating, stopped going to school, and spent more time in her room. At night, I could hear the whispering again. Sometimes it sounded like a soft murmur. Other times it was a loud growl, like an animal's growl coming from her throat. But the worst part was the laughter. Every time I heard it, it was like an evil, mocking laugh that echoed through the house. I knew then that something was seriously wrong. One night, after hearing the growling from Rachel's room again, I decided to call my parents. I found them sitting in the living room, but they didn't look right. They were sitting in complete silence, their eyes fixed on the floor, as if they couldn't hear me. I waved my hands in front of their faces, but they didn't react. I turned to leave, but I felt something cold brush against my neck. I turned quickly, but no one was there. I was terrified. I ran upstairs to check on Rachel, and what I saw made my blood run cold. She was standing in the corner of her room, her arms stretched out, her fingers twisted at unnatural angles. Her head was tilted backward, and she was laughing so loud that it shook the walls. "Help me," I whispered, stepping closer. Rachel's body turned to face me, but her eyes were no longer her own. They were completely black. No whites, no pupils, just solid black. She grinned, her mouth widening unnaturally. "You shouldn't have come in here," the voice hissed. "Now you're mine too." I stumbled backward, falling to the ground in fear. I was paralyzed. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. It felt like the air was closing in around me, pressing against my chest. The laughter grew louder, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch toward me, as if they were alive. Just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the door to the room slammed open. My father stood there, his face pale and drawn, but with a look of determination in his eyes. Behind him was a man I had never seen before, tall, with dark hair and a heavy black coat. He looked out of place in our home, like someone who didn't belong in this world. The man stepped into the room without hesitation, his eyes fixed on Rachel. "It's time," he said, his voice firm and clear. Rachel's body convulsed violently, her limbs jerking like a puppet on a string. The deep growl filled the room once more, and her head twisted around to face the stranger. "You can't stop me," the voice snarled. "She's mine." The man didn't flinch. He took a step forward and placed his hand on Rachel's forehead. "In the name of God, I command you to leave this girl," he shouted. For a moment, nothing happened. The room was dead silent, and I held my breath, praying that something would change. Then, with a horrific scream, Rachel's body arched backward, her mouth opening wide, and a forceful gust of wind blew through the room, knocking us all back. The shadows in the room seemed to vanish, and Rachel collapsed to the floor. The air felt lighter, as if the weight of the house had been lifted. But Rachel was unconscious, lying still on the floor. The man, Father Michael, as he later introduced himself, was an exorcist. He told us that the house had been cursed for years. The previous owners had left after the last family member passed away under mysterious circumstances, and no one had been brave enough to live there since. The evil presence had been waiting for someone to move in. The exorcism wasn't easy. It took several hours, with Father Michael chanting prayers and using holy water to cleanse the house. Rachel's body had fought back, and the voice inside her fought harder than we could have imagined. But eventually, after what felt like an eternity, it was over. The demon was gone. Rachel woke up hours later, confused and exhausted. She didn't remember anything that had happened, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She wasn't the same girl anymore. The darkness that had overtaken her had left a mark. It wasn't just Rachel who had changed. The house felt different too. Lighter, cleaner. The oppressive weight that had hung in the air was gone, and it felt like we could finally breathe again. We moved out a few months later, unable to shake the memory of what happened. But the truth is, I'll never forget it. I'll never forget the growls, the laughter, or the way Rachel's eyes turned completely black. The experience taught me that sometimes evil doesn't just exist in stories. It's real. It can take over, twist your loved ones into something unrecognizable, and you may never know when it will strike next. So if you ever find yourself in an old house, one that feels too quiet, too still, listen. Listen for the whispers in the shadows. You might just hear something you're not supposed to hear. It started like any other summer. My family had just moved to Ravenswood, a small town tucked away between dense woods and rolling hills. It was a quiet place, the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary. My parents were excited about the move. Fresh start, new beginnings. But I, on the other hand, was a little more skeptical. I wasn't thrilled about leaving my old friends behind, and the house we had bought seemed off. It wasn't a bad house, just old. The kind of place you might find in an old storybook, with creaky floors, dark corners, and a history that no one ever really talked about. Ravenswood was known for its long history. It was a place with deep roots, but there were also stories about it, whispers about the land, about things that had happened long before we arrived. Most people didn't speak of it openly, but I could sense it in the air, like a tension that no one wanted to acknowledge. It felt like the town was hiding something. When we first arrived, my younger brother, Luke, was the first to explore the house. He was 8 years old, and like most kids, he had no real fear of old places. I, on the other hand, couldn't shake the sense of dread that seemed to cling to the walls. But I pushed those feelings aside and tried to settle in. The first few days were uneventful. We unpacked, set up the house, and tried to make it feel like home. But there was always something wrong with the house at night. It wasn't just the creaking of the old floorboards or the sound of the wind outside. It was the feeling. It was as if something was watching us, something that wasn't quite right. I told myself I was imagining things. After all, I had grown up hearing ghost stories and urban legends. But as the days passed, I started to notice little things. Small, unexplainable things that didn't add up. Luke was the first one to truly experience it. It started with his toys. At first, I thought he was just being a typical kid, leaving his things scattered around. But then, one day, I found his action figures placed perfectly in a line, facing the corner of his room. There was no way Luke could have done it. I had watched him leave the room just before I entered, and he was too young to set up his toys in such an eerie way. I asked him about it, and he just shrugged, saying that the toys wanted to be there. I chalked it up to his imagination. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood up when I saw how serious he looked. That night, I heard something odd. It was a soft, repetitive scratching sound coming from Luke's room. At first, I thought it was the wind, or maybe a mouse in the walls. But when I opened his door, I froze. Luke was sitting in the middle of the room, his back to me, facing the corner where the toys had been earlier. His head was tilted slightly, like he was listening to something. "Luke?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't respond. I stepped closer, and that's when I saw it. His eyes were wide open, but they were blank, like he wasn't really there. It was as if he was in a trance. "Luke," I said again, more urgently this time. "What's wrong?" Without turning to face me, Luke spoke, but it wasn't his voice. It was deeper, raspier, and the words he spoke didn't make sense. "Leave. Leave this place." I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't just the words. It was the way he said them, like he was being forced to speak them, like something was using him as a vessel. I quickly rushed to his side, shaking him, but his body was stiff, unmoving. His eyes snapped to me, and that's when I saw them. His pupils were completely black, like two voids of darkness. I stumbled back, my heart racing. "What's happening to him?" I whispered, my voice shaking with fear. Before I could react, Luke blinked, and the blackness faded from his eyes. He looked around, confused, like he had just woken up from a dream. I don't know what happened," he said softly, his voice trembling. "I heard someone talking." The next day, things only got worse. I did my best to ignore the strange occurrences, but it was impossible to avoid them. The whispering grew louder at night, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I'd hear it in the hallway, in the basement, even in the kitchen when I was alone. It was always the same, soft, insistent whispers that I couldn't make out, but that sounded almost angry. Luke became more withdrawn, and even my parents started acting strange. They weren't themselves. My mom would sometimes stare out of the window for hours without speaking, and my dad's temper seemed to flare up for no reason. One night, things took a turn for the worse. I was sitting in the living room, trying to relax, when I heard a loud bang from upstairs. It sounded like furniture being knocked over. My heart raced as I ran upstairs, my feet echoing in the empty hallways. When I reached Luke's room, the door was wide open, and the room was completely dark. "Luke," I called, but there was no answer. I stepped inside, and that's when I saw it. Luke was standing in the middle of the room, his head tilted back, his body rigid. His mouth was open, but it wasn't Luke's voice that came out. It was that same deep, guttural voice, but this time, it was accompanied by a chilling laugh. "It's too late now," the voice mocked. "You can't stop it. You can't stop us." I felt my knees go weak. This wasn't my brother anymore. This thing was using him, controlling him. I ran downstairs to find my parents, but they were nowhere to be found. It was as if the house had swallowed them whole. Panic rose in my chest. I didn't know what to do. That's when I remembered something one of the townspeople had told me when we first moved in. "There's a priest in Ravenswood," the elderly woman had said. "He's helped before, with the things that come from below." Desperate, I drove to the church that evening. Father Donnelly was an old man, but his eyes were sharp, and there was a quiet strength about him. When I told him about Luke and the strange happenings in the house, he didn't hesitate. "I've dealt with this before," he said gravely. "There's darkness in that house, a presence that's been there for a long time." We returned to the house, Father Donnelly carrying a small bag of holy items, candles, incense, and a vial of holy water. When we stepped inside, the air felt heavy, oppressive, like the walls were closing in. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening. Father Donnelly led me upstairs, where Luke stood, staring blankly at the wall. The exorcism began. Father Donnelly's voice echoed through the room as he recited prayers in Latin, his hand held steady over Luke's head. At first, nothing happened, but then Luke's body began to shake violently. His mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, and that deep, mocking voice returned. "You think you can banish me?" it hissed. "You think you can send me back?" The room grew colder, and the shadows seemed to move, creeping toward us like a living thing. The air was thick with malevolence, but Father Donnelly didn't falter. He continued to speak, louder and more forcefully, as the demon inside Luke howled in fury. Suddenly, Luke's body arched backward, his limbs twisted in unnatural angles. The room seemed to shake with the power of the demon's rage. But Father Donnelly pressed on, his voice rising in intensity. With one final command, the demon screamed and was gone. Luke collapsed to the ground, unconscious, but the darkness that had clung to him was gone. The house seemed to exhale, the weight lifting from the air. For the first time in weeks, it felt like the house was just a house again, empty and quiet. Luke woke up hours later, confused but safe. The darkness in his eyes was gone, and he was himself again. But I knew, deep down, that something had changed. The house had left its mark on us, and I would never forget what I had seen, what I had witnessed in that room. We left Ravenswood shortly after. I couldn't stay in that house any longer, couldn't live with the memory of what had happened there. But sometimes, even now, when I'm alone at night, I can still hear the whispers, and I know they're waiting, just beyond the shadows. Some things are never truly gone. They wait in the darkness, biding their time. It all began in the small, quiet town of Stony Ridge, a place where nothing ever seemed to happen. The kind of town that wasn't on any major map, just a collection of sleepy streets, old houses, and a history that was rarely spoken of. My name is Sophie, and my family and I had recently moved into a house there. It wasn't our choice, really. My father had gotten a job transfer, and we were forced to relocate. It wasn't the worst thing in the world. The house was old, yes, but it had character. High ceilings, creaky wooden floors, and a big backyard. We were just happy to finally settle in after the long drive. But as we unpacked our things and started making the house feel like home, there was an unease in the air that I couldn't shake. It was subtle at first, a faint chill that would suddenly appear in the air, or the feeling that someone was watching me when I was alone in the house. I brushed it off as the stress of the move, but it lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. It wasn't until one night, a few weeks after we moved in, that I realized something was very wrong. I was sitting in my room, reading a book, when I heard a soft, tapping sound coming from the floor. I figured it was just the house settling, but then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. It was rhythmic, almost like someone was tapping their fingers against the wood. I tried to ignore it, but the sound grew louder, more insistent. I walked over to the spot where I thought it was coming from, near the corner of the room, but there was nothing there. I thought it was strange, but I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just a weird creak in the old house. But as the night went on, the tapping didn't stop. It continued, moving slowly across the room. At first, it seemed like it was just a harmless sound, but the more I heard it, the more unsettled I became. It was then that I saw something that made my blood run cold. The floorboards near the corner of my room started to warp. It wasn't dramatic, but the wood began to shift, like something was pushing from beneath the floor. I stepped back in horror, my heart pounding in my chest. I stared at the floor, too afraid to move, as the tapping grew louder, more frantic. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I stood there for what felt like hours, frozen in place, trying to process what had just happened. I was too scared to sleep in my room that night, so I stayed on the couch in the living room, hoping that whatever had happened would just be a one-time thing. But the next night, it happened again. This time, I wasn't alone. My younger brother, Ben, was staying in my room while his own was being painted. He had been asleep for hours when the tapping started again. I heard it faintly at first, but it quickly grew louder, much louder than the night before. I rushed to Ben's side, shaking him awake. "Ben, wake up," I whispered urgently, but he didn't stir. The tapping grew into a violent scratching sound, as if something was clawing at the floor from beneath. I could feel the air growing colder, the tension in the room thickening with every passing second. I looked around, my heart racing, but there was no escape. The floorboards beneath me seemed to groan under some unseen weight, and the scratching sound grew louder, angrier. And then, Ben's voice, barely a whisper, came from the shadows. "Sophie, it's here." I froze. He had been asleep. How could he have known? But there was something in his voice that made my blood run cold. The room felt like it was suffocating me, the walls closing in. "Ben, what do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. From the dark corner of the room, Ben slowly turned to face me. His eyes were wide, and his expression was blank, empty. His lips parted, but the voice that came out of his mouth was not his own. It was deep, guttural, like something far older and far more sinister than anything I had ever heard. "It's watching you," the voice rasped, as if savoring the words. "It's been waiting." I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. I tried to shake Ben awake, but his body was stiff, like a puppet with its strings cut. His head snapped to the side, and that same deep, throaty voice spoke again. "You shouldn't have come here," it hissed. "This place is ours." I ran out of the room, panic surging through me. I found my parents in their bedroom and told them what had happened. They, of course, didn't believe me at first. They assumed it was just a nightmare, or some kind of weird trick my mind was playing on me. But that night, my father decided to investigate the house, just to put my fears to rest. He spent hours going through the house, checking every corner, inspecting the walls, and trying to figure out what was causing the strange noises. But he found nothing. No signs of rodents or any kind of explanation for the sounds. He told me it was just the old house settling, that there was nothing to worry about. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. The tapping returned, louder and more intense this time, as if whatever was under the floor was growing impatient. I could hear it moving beneath me, scratching, clawing at the wood. It sounded like something was trying to get out. Then, as I lay there paralyzed in fear, I heard a soft voice, Ben's voice, whisper from the darkness. "Sophie, come closer." I tried to call out for my parents, but my voice was caught in my throat. I knew I had to leave the room, but I couldn't move. The air felt thick, heavy, like something was suffocating me. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch and bend, distorting into grotesque shapes that danced around the edges of my vision. And then, the floorboards groaned, as if something was rising from beneath them. It was then that I heard something that I will never forget. A deep, resonant voice, older, more powerful than anything I had heard before, spoke from beneath the floorboards. "We are Legion." The floor exploded, sending wooden shards flying in every direction. A dark figure emerged from the hole, its form a swirling mass of shadow and malice. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. An entity that seemed to exist only in darkness, a creature born of nightmare. I screamed, but no sound came out. I turned and ran, stumbling down the hallway, desperately searching for my parents. But they were gone, completely gone, as if the house had swallowed them whole. The darkness seemed to close in on me, and I knew I couldn't escape it. The thing from beneath the floor was following me. In a desperate panic, I grabbed my phone and called the one person I could think of, Father Thomas, the local priest. He had always been kind to us, and I hoped he could help. I barely got a word out before the line went dead, and I was left in the suffocating silence of the house. That's when the door to my room creaked open. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and there stood my parents. But they weren't themselves. Their eyes were vacant, their movements stiff. They didn't speak, but I could hear their voices, deep, guttural, like something was using them as a vessel. "We are Legion," they repeated in unison as they slowly advanced toward me. Just as I thought I was about to lose everything, I heard a loud bang from downstairs. Father Thomas appeared in the doorway, holding a crucifix in one hand and a vial of holy water in the other. He stepped into the room, his voice unwavering as he began to recite prayers in Latin. The house trembled with a violent force. The shadows in the corners of the room writhed like snakes. The dark figure from beneath the floor screeched in fury as Father Thomas moved closer, his words growing louder and more powerful. The walls shook with an unnatural force, and the temperature in the room plummeted. But Father Thomas didn't stop. He continued to speak, commanding the evil presence to leave. Finally, with a bone-chilling scream that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, the entity was gone. The silence that followed was deafening. The air was thick with the weight of what had just transpired. I stood there, trembling, as Father Thomas helped me and my parents regain control. The entity was gone, but the house was forever marked by its presence. We left Stony Ridge shortly after. My parents never spoke of the events that transpired, but I knew they would never be the same. And neither would I. Some houses hold things beneath the floorboards, things better left undisturbed. And sometimes, those things are waiting for someone to come along and awaken them. I never believed in the supernatural. I always thought the stories were just that, stories. My family moved into a new house in the small town of Hollow Creek when I was 16. It was an old farmhouse, nestled on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense woods. The kind of place you'd see in a horror movie, with creaking floorboards and dusty corners. But it was affordable, and my parents were thrilled to start over after a rough few years. The house itself was beautiful, despite its age. It had tall windows, a large porch with a swing, and a sprawling attic that my brother and I were excited to explore. But there was something strange about the place from the moment we arrived. Maybe it was the way the wind seemed to howl through the trees, or the way the house seemed to groan and creak at night, even though there was no wind. At first, I shrugged it off as old house problems, things that come with age. We spent the first week settling in, and everything seemed normal. My younger brother, Adam, and I started unpacking boxes and organizing our rooms. I even found a journal hidden behind some old books in the attic, but I didn't think much of it. It was just the ramblings of someone who had lived there before. It wasn't until the second week that things started to get strange. I was up late one night, reading in my room, when I heard a sound coming from the attic. It was soft at first, like a tapping or scraping noise. I figured it was just the house settling, but the sound grew louder, more persistent. It started to sound like something, or someone, was moving around up there. Curious and a little unnerved, I grabbed a flashlight and headed upstairs. The attic was dark, filled with old furniture and boxes. The air smelled musty, and the floorboards creaked underfoot. I called out to see if Adam was up there, but there was no response. Then, I heard it again, a soft scraping sound coming from the far corner of the attic. I shone the flashlight in that direction and froze. There, in the corner, standing motionless, was a figure. A girl. She was tall and thin, her face obscured by her long, dark hair. Her hands were held at her sides, and her body was rigid. I felt my heart skip a beat, my stomach turning with fear. I tried to call out to her, but my voice caught in my throat. I took a step forward, and suddenly, the girl turned her head to look at me. Her eyes were empty, black, hollow voids where eyes should be. I gasped and stumbled backward, my heart racing. The girl didn't move, but she tilted her head slightly, as if studying me. I turned and ran out of the attic, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. What had I just seen? Was I imagining things? I couldn't explain it, but I knew what I had seen was real. There was something wrong with the house, something I couldn't ignore. The next few days, the house seemed to get colder. I would wake up in the middle of the night to find the windows wide open, despite the fact that I had closed them before going to bed. The tapping from the attic grew louder, more frantic, as if something was trying to get out. I didn't want to tell my parents, they would just think I was overreacting. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in that house. It wasn't until one afternoon that things took a turn for the worse. I was sitting in the living room when I heard Adam's voice coming from upstairs. At first, it sounded like he was talking to someone, but when I listened closer, I realized it wasn't his voice. It was different. It was deeper, raspy, almost as if it were coming from someone else entirely. I ran up the stairs to check on him, but when I reached his room, I stopped dead in my tracks. Adam was sitting on his bed, his back to me, his head bent low, but there was something horribly wrong with him. His voice, that deep, guttural voice, was coming from him, but his mouth wasn't moving. Instead, it was like the words were coming from somewhere deep within him. "We are legion," the voice rasped. "We are many." I felt the blood drain from my face. I knew those words. They were the words spoken by demons in stories, in movies, in ancient texts. This wasn't my brother anymore. Something had taken him, and I was terrified. I called out to him, trying to get him to snap out of whatever trance he was in, but he didn't respond. His body was rigid, his face pale and twisted into an unnatural grin. I backed away slowly, my heart racing. This was beyond anything I could understand. Frantic, I ran to my parents, but when I found them in the kitchen, they were standing completely still, staring blankly ahead. Their eyes were empty, their faces expressionless, as if they were mere shells of who they once were. I shook them, trying to get them to react, but nothing changed. It was then that I realized it wasn't just Adam. The entire house was affected. I ran back upstairs, knowing that I had to do something. I tried shaking Adam again, but his body didn't respond. Then, suddenly, his eyes snapped open, but they weren't his eyes. They were black, just like the girl in the attic. He looked up at me, and that same deep voice came from him again. "You shouldn't have come here," it growled. "Now you belong to us." I was paralyzed with fear. I didn't know what to do. The room felt like it was closing in on me, and I could feel the temperature drop. The air became thick and heavy, suffocating me. That's when I remembered something I had read in the journal I found in the attic. It spoke of a dark entity that had once lived in the house, a malevolent force that had taken the lives of several families who had come before us. Desperate, I ran down to the basement and grabbed the old Bible that I had found among the boxes of stuff left behind by the previous owners. I didn't know what else to do. I held it up, flipping through the pages until I found the verses I needed. I didn't know the words by heart, but I recited them with everything I had. "By the power of Christ, I command you to leave this place." Nothing happened at first, but I kept reciting the verses. The air grew colder still, the shadows around me lengthened, and I could hear whispers coming from every corner of the room. It felt like the house was alive, like it was fighting back. Then, with a sudden crash, the attic door flew open, and a figure appeared in the doorway. It was the girl. She was standing there, her hair matted to her face, her eyes wide open and empty. She let out a low, otherworldly growl. But then, as I continued to chant the verses, something shifted. The darkness in the room seemed to recede. the oppressive weight lifting just a little bit. The girl let out a piercing scream, and then, as if being pulled by an invisible force, she disappeared. Adam's body fell limp onto the bed, and the voice was gone. His eyes cleared, and he looked up at me, confused, but very much himself again. The house seemed to exhale, as if it had been holding its breath for far too long. My parents finally snapped out of their trance, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. They didn't know what had happened, but they knew something was terribly wrong. It was then that we realized the house had been possessed, that whatever had been lurking in the attic had taken control of Adam, of all of us. In the days that followed, we contacted a priest. Father O'Malley arrived a few days later, and after hearing our story, he agreed to perform an exorcism on the house. It took hours, but the air grew lighter. The house seemed to settle, and the dark presence that had taken hold of us was finally driven out. We left Hollow Creek shortly afterward. I couldn't shake the feeling that something in that house had been awakened, something ancient and evil. And even now, whenever I close my eyes at night, I still see the girl in the attic. I still hear her whispering in the darkness. And I know, deep down, that some things are never truly gone. They just wait, and they never forget. I had always been a skeptic. My parents were the type to watch horror movies at night, while I rolled my eyes and joked about how fake everything looked. Ghosts, demons, possessions, they were all just stories to me, no different from the fairy tales we read in childhood. But that all changed the day we moved to Black Hollow. Black Hollow was the kind of town that didn't make it onto tourist maps. It was a tiny, forgotten place with long, winding roads that led through dense forests. There was one school, one church, and a few scattered homes. People kept to themselves, and strangers were viewed with suspicion. Our family had moved there because my father got a job at the local factory, and it wasn't too far from the city. But the first day we arrived, I felt a heaviness in the air, as though the town itself was holding its breath. The house we moved into was an old, rambling structure on the edge of town, tucked between two large oak trees. It looked perfect at first, a charming, albeit slightly run-down Victorian home. The kind of place that looked like it had a story to tell. It had a tall, sloped roof, windows that stared blankly out at the world, and an attic that I knew I would explore as soon as I had a moment. But from the very first night, something felt off. The house was cold, despite the warm weather outside. The air felt thick, as though it was charged with something I couldn't name. At first, I chalked it up to the fact that we were in a new place, adjusting to our surroundings. But the deeper we got into unpacking, the more I noticed strange things happening. My younger brother, Tim, started acting oddly. He was always a little shy, but over the course of the first few days in Black Hollow, he became more withdrawn, quiet. He spent hours staring out of the windows, sometimes whispering to himself. When I asked him what he was doing, he'd mumble something about the voices. I thought he was just being dramatic, or maybe he had heard something from the woods that unsettled him. But then, one evening, it happened. I was sitting in the living room, reading a book, when I heard Tim's voice calling from the attic. He sounded strange. His tone was high-pitched, almost frantic. I thought he was playing some sort of game, so I walked up the stairs to see what he was up to. When I reached the door to the attic, it was open, a thin crack of light shining through. I called his name, but he didn't answer. I stepped inside. The attic was dark, save for a small light flickering at the far end of the room. Dust floated in the air, and the floor creaked underfoot. There were boxes everywhere, along with old furniture and what looked like the remnants of a lifelong past. But in the corner of the attic, I saw him. Tim was standing still, staring at the far wall, his back turned to me. "Tim?" I called, my voice shaking slightly. He didn't move. Then, very slowly, he turned around. What I saw made my blood run cold. Tim's eyes were wide open, but they were completely black. No whites, just dark, endless voids. His skin was pale, almost sickly looking, and there was something about his face that was wrong. It wasn't just his appearance, it was his expression. He didn't seem like Tim anymore. He looked like something else, something that wasn't human. "Tim," I whispered, stepping back. "What's going on? Are you okay?" But the voice that came out of his mouth wasn't his own. It was deep, guttural, like something ancient and sinister was speaking through him. "You shouldn't have come here," it hissed. "You're ours now." I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. This couldn't be real. I must have been dreaming, or maybe I had inhaled too much dust from the attic. I turned and ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But I knew what I saw. I knew that something had taken hold of my brother. That night, I didn't sleep. Every little creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, made me jump. My mind kept replaying Tim's black eyes, that voice, and the horrible feeling that we weren't alone in that house. The next morning, Tim was back to normal. Or at least, he seemed to be. He had no memory of what had happened in the attic, and he claimed he had been asleep when I found him. But I knew better. Something was changing in him. I saw it in the way he looked at me sometimes, with a coldness that made me shiver. Things only got worse from there. Over the next few weeks, the house seemed to grow colder, and more unsettling things began happening. Objects would move on their own, books falling off shelves, furniture shifting slightly in the middle of the night. The sound of whispering voices filled the house when no one else was around. I couldn't understand what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't just my brother that was affected. It was the house itself. One evening, after dinner, I was sitting alone in the kitchen when I heard a soft, knocking sound coming from the basement door. It was faint at first, but then it grew louder, more rhythmic. I stood up, frozen with fear, and watched as the door began to rattle, as if something or someone was trying to get out. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran to the living room and told my parents, but they just brushed it off as the house settling. I knew they didn't believe me, and I couldn't blame them. If I hadn't seen what I had seen in the attic, I might have dismissed it all too. But I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something dark had taken hold of this house, and it was feeding off of us. That night, I couldn't sleep. I could feel the presence, the weight of it, pressing down on me. The whispers grew louder, almost like they were coming from the walls themselves. Then I heard a voice, Tim's voice, calling me from the attic. I couldn't let him be alone up there, not after everything that had happened. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the attic, the door was slightly ajar. I hesitated for a moment, but then pushed it open. Tim was standing in the same spot where I had found him before, his back to me, staring at the far wall. This time, though, I could see something more. Shadows seemed to flicker in the corner of the room, moving in ways they shouldn't. "Tim," I called, my voice trembling. "What's happening? Please, talk to me." He didn't answer. I stepped closer, my flashlight beam landing on his face. The blackness in his eyes was even darker this time, consuming all light, like endless pits. But this time, he spoke without turning around. "You are ours," he said, his voice echoing with the same deep, guttural growl from before. "We've been waiting." The shadows behind him began to stretch, twisting into shapes that shouldn't have been possible. Long, thin figures with sharp, jagged limbs, crawling up the walls toward me. I felt my stomach churn, and terror swept over me. I backed away, my breath quickening, but Tim stayed still, rooted in place like a puppet under someone's control. Then, out of nowhere, the whispers became shouts. The walls themselves seemed to scream, the house shuddering as if it were alive, trying to break free from the nightmare that had taken hold of it. I didn't know what to do, but instinct kicked in. I ran down the stairs and grabbed my parents. I didn't care if they thought I was crazy. I needed help. I begged them to listen, to do something before it was too late. We called Father O'Malley, the priest from the local church, but when he arrived, the house was already too far gone. The shadows were everywhere, creeping along the walls and floors. Tim was no longer Tim. He was something else entirely, his body writhing, his mouth open in a terrible, silent scream. Father O'Malley didn't waste any time. He started praying immediately, his voice steady and strong, calling on God to drive the darkness out. The air grew colder, the shadows fighting back, but he persisted. He began to recite the ancient exorcism prayers, his voice rising above the whispers and screams. For what felt like hours, we battled the evil in that house. But slowly, the darkness began to recede, like a storm that had finally run its course. Tim's body relaxed, the blackness in his eyes fading away. The house groaned one last time, then fell silent. The presence was gone. The house was no longer a prison of darkness. But even now, years later, I can't forget what happened in Black Hollow. I still hear the whispers sometimes, when I'm alone, and every now and then, I feel the cold breath of something unseen on the back of my neck. Some places never let go of their darkness, and some stories are too horrifying to forget. I used to believe that nothing could truly scare me. Sure, I had my share of jump scares in horror movies, and the occasional creepy moment in an old house, but I always managed to laugh it off. But that was before I met Clara, before I experienced the horrors of Rosemary Hill. It started innocently enough. I was a college student, studying history and anthropology, and during the summer break, I took a job as an assistant for Professor Daniels. He had a particular interest in the occult and the supernatural, and while I was skeptical, I was intrigued by the old books and artifacts he collected. That summer, he was researching a case from the 1970s, a series of strange events that took place in a small town just outside of our city. The town was called Rosemary Hill, and the story had fascinated me since I first heard of it. I had even read about it in an old article for one of my history classes. It involved a young woman, Clara, who had reportedly been possessed by a demon, and the exorcism that followed. Professor Daniels had told me that he was working on a paper about the exorcism of Clara, and he needed my help to sift through the archives at the local library. We set out to Rosemary Hill to investigate the case further. Rosemary Hill itself was an eerie little town, hidden away from the rest of the world. It was full of old houses, narrow streets, and dense woods that seemed to close in around the place. The moment we arrived, I felt a strange heaviness in the air, like the town itself was waiting for something. My unease deepened when we visited the small local cemetery where Clara was buried. The gravestone was simple, but there was something about it that sent a chill down my spine. That night, we stayed at an old inn, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. I had trouble sleeping, so I decided to walk around the town to clear my head. As I wandered through the quiet streets, I found myself drawn to the old church at the edge of town. It was in disrepair, its windows shattered, the doors hanging off their hinges. But there was something about the church that felt different. I walked closer, feeling an almost magnetic pull. I don't know what made me step inside. Perhaps it was the curiosity that had always led me toward the unknown. Or perhaps it was the strange feeling that the church was calling to me. As soon as I stepped through the door, the temperature dropped. I felt the air grow thick with something oppressive, something dark. I wandered through the ruined church, and that's when I saw the altar. There, in the center of the room, was an old, cracked stone altar. It looked ancient, its surface etched with strange symbols I couldn't recognize, and it was covered in dust, like no one had touched it in years. Then, I heard it, a voice, a whisper, so soft I could barely make it out. But it was there, calling my name. Rosemary. I froze. Rosemary, come closer. I turned around quickly, expecting to see someone behind me. But the church was empty. The air grew colder, and the whispers became louder, more insistent. The voice sounded like it was coming from all around me, as though the very walls of the church were alive. My heart was pounding in my chest. I turned to leave, but as I did, something stopped me. A figure. In the shadows, I could see a woman standing there. She was tall and thin, dressed in a long, flowing white gown. Her face was obscured by long, dark hair that hung in matted strands over her eyes. But there was something about her, something unnatural. My breath caught in my throat. She wasn't supposed to be there. This place had been abandoned for years. I knew I had to get out of there, but my legs wouldn't move. Clara, the voice whispered again, now loud enough to echo in my head. You've come home. Suddenly, everything went black. When I woke up, I was back in the inn. I don't remember how I got there, but I was shaken to my core. I felt like I had been in the church for hours, but it was only a few minutes. My heart raced and I couldn't stop shaking. I told Professor Daniels what had happened, but he dismissed it as a vivid dream or a trick of the mind. He didn't believe in the supernatural, not really, but I knew what I had experienced was real. The next day, we visited the local library, hoping to find more information on Clara's case. We uncovered old police reports, newspaper clippings, and first-hand accounts of the exorcism. Clara had been a quiet, religious young woman until she suddenly began exhibiting strange behaviors, talking in unknown languages, showing unnatural strength, and having violent outbursts. Her family sought help from the local priest, but when his prayers failed, they turned to a renowned exorcist, Father Thomas. According to the accounts, Clara's exorcism was long and brutal. It was said that during the process, she was violently thrown across the room, her voice changing to a deep, guttural growl. The demon that possessed her taunted the priest, speaking in an ancient language and claiming that Clara was meant to be its vessel. But Father Thomas was relentless, and after hours of struggle, the demon was cast out. Clara was said to have fallen into a deep sleep, and when she woke, she had no memory of what had happened. But the events that had taken place during the exorcism were so disturbing that the church had sealed the case and prevented further investigation. But something about the case didn't sit right with me. As we read through the reports, I felt a sense of dread wash over me. There were too many inconsistencies, too many details that didn't add up. Why had the demon chosen Clara? What had drawn it to her? The more I learned, the more I realized that something was still not right about Rosemary Hill. I began to notice strange occurrences at the library. Books would fall off shelves when I wasn't looking, and I would catch glimpses of movement in the corners of my eyes, as though someone, or something, was watching me. The whispers began again, soft at first, but then growing louder. It felt like the entire town was alive with a dark energy that I couldn't explain. One night, as we were preparing to leave, I heard the whispers again. This time, they were clearer, more urgent. "Rosemary, come back." I turned, and there she was again, the figure in the white gown, standing just outside the library's entrance. I felt a chill race down my spine. I didn't want to go back to the church, but something in me urged me forward. I walked toward her, my legs moving on their own, and before I knew it, I was standing in the same ruined church. The altar was now bathed in an eerie, otherworldly glow, and the temperature had dropped so low that I could see my breath in front of me. Clara's figure stood at the altar, her long, dark hair falling over her face, her eyes hidden, but I could feel her presence. I could feel the evil that radiated from her like an aura. "You shouldn't have come back," she whispered, her voice like a distant echo. "It's too late. It's already too late." I wanted to scream, but I couldn't find my voice. I felt myself drawn toward the altar, unable to stop myself. The whispers in my head were deafening now, louder than before, urging me closer. And then I saw it. In the darkness, a shadow began to move. It was large, almost towering, and it seemed to glide across the floor toward me. Its eyes were burning red, glowing like embers, and its mouth was twisted into a cruel, mocking grin. It was the demon that had once possessed Clara. I could hear its voice in my mind, speaking directly to me. "You've come too close. You'll never leave. This town belongs to us." Before I could react, a bright light filled the room. Father Thomas appeared, his voice steady as he began to chant in a language I couldn't understand. The demon screeched in anger, the walls of the church shaking as if they were about to collapse. The light grew brighter, and the demon howled in fury, its red eyes fading to black as it retreated into the darkness. Father Thomas stepped forward, his eyes full of determination. "Get out of here now," he shouted at me. I didn't need any more convincing. I ran as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the safety of the inn. That night, I dreamed of Clara. She stood in the ruins of the church, her eyes now open, empty black voids staring back at me. Her voice echoed in my mind, soft and sinister. "You're not finished, Rosemary. The town will never let you leave." When I woke, I was back in my bed, drenched in sweat. It had all felt so real. I wasn't sure what was real anymore. The next morning, we left Rosemary Hill. I never returned, but the memory of Clara and the darkness that still lingered in that town haunts me to this day. I don't know what happened to Clara or what the demon wanted, but I do know one thing. Some places are better left alone, and some spirits never rest. It was supposed to be a normal day. I was only 18 at the time, living in a small town with my family. Things were peaceful, almost too peaceful, and that made me feel safe. I had always been the skeptical type, never buying into the stories of ghosts or demons that some of my friends like to tell. To me, it was all fiction, the stuff of movies and novels. I couldn't have been more wrong. It started with a mirror. It wasn't an expensive one. In fact, it was an old, tarnished piece that we had inherited from my great-aunt. She passed away just a few months ago, and we kept most of her belongings as a way to remember her. The mirror had been stored in the attic, along with some other things we didn't use. My mom, in her attempt to clean the house, brought it downstairs one day and placed it in the hallway just outside the living room. It was a large mirror, probably from the late 1800s, framed in a dark wood that had been chipped with age. I remember thinking it looked out of place, but there was something more to it that I couldn't explain. I didn't think much of it until the first strange occurrence. It was a rainy evening, and I was sitting in the living room, reading a book. The mirror, as usual, was hanging quietly on the wall. I didn't even realize I was staring at it until I noticed a shift in the reflection. The hallway behind me looked normal, but for a split second, something caught my eye. There was a shadow moving in the reflection, something tall and dark that wasn't in the hallway at all. I shook my head. It was probably just my imagination, I told myself, but it bothered me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep. The wind howled outside, and the rain tapped against the window. I could hear faint sounds from the house, creaking floors, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of the television still playing in the living room. I was almost asleep when I heard it, a low, rasping breath. It came from the hallway. It was strange, like a soft whisper, but almost like it was struggling to be heard. I froze, my heart racing in my chest. My room was dark, but the faint light from the hallway illuminated the edges of the door. I lay still, listening, waiting. Then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate steps that echoed softly through the hallway. My mind raced, wondering if it was one of my parents walking around. But when I checked the time, it was past midnight. Both of them were in their room, asleep. I slowly pulled the covers over my head, trying to ignore the growing unease in my stomach. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I felt as if something was standing just on the other side, watching me. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. And then, in the silence, I heard it again. Just a whisper. "You're mine." I jerked upright, my heart pounding, the words echoing in my head. I threw the covers off and bolted out of bed. But when I opened the door, there was nothing there. The hallway was empty, the mirror hanging quietly on the wall. I ran into my parents' room, shaking and terrified. But when I told them what had happened, they only dismissed it as a bad dream. "You're just imagining things, honey," my mom said, her voice calm and reassuring. But I knew it wasn't a dream. Something had been in the house, and it was not something I could explain away. The next day, I decided to do some research. I went online and found that mirrors were often associated with paranormal activity. Ghosts, spirits, and even demons were said to use mirrors as a way to cross over into our world. I was skeptical, but at this point, I couldn't ignore what I'd experienced. I started looking into the history of the mirror, trying to find any clues. After some digging, I found out that my great-aunt had always been a bit of an eccentric woman. She was religious, but there had always been rumors about her strange rituals. She had reportedly lived alone for the last decade of her life, and some people in the town had whispered that she had been involved in occult practices. I found nothing concrete, but the more I thought about it, the more I wondered if that mirror had something to do with the strange events that were happening in our house. It wasn't until the third night that things took a terrifying turn. I was lying in bed again, trying to ignore the unease gnawing at me. The rain had stopped, but the wind still howled outside. The mirror, as usual, hung silently in the hallway. I felt my eyes drawn to it, as if something inside me was urging me to look. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't help myself. Slowly, I got out of bed and crept toward the hallway. As I approached the mirror, I felt a coldness in the air. My breath fogged up as I reached the frame. I stood there for a moment, staring at my reflection, but then it changed. The reflection in the mirror wasn't mine. It was someone else's. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, but the longer I stared, the clearer it became. The figure in the mirror was tall and thin, with long, dark hair that covered its face. Its skin was pale, almost sickly, and its eyes were dark, empty pits. It stood motionless, staring back at me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I took a step back. That's when it moved. The figure in the mirror smiled. A cold, wide smile that didn't belong to anyone human. And then it spoke. "You can't escape me," I gasped, stumbling backward. I ran back to my room, slamming the door behind me. My whole body was trembling. The voice, the reflection, everything about it felt wrong, unnatural. I grabbed my phone and texted my best friend, telling her everything that had happened. She tried to reassure me, telling me I was probably just overthinking things, but I knew deep down that something was very wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I stayed in my room, the door locked tight, the covers pulled up to my chin. I kept hearing whispers, soft and distant, coming from the hallway. I told myself it was just the wind, the house settling, but deep down, I knew the truth. Something was trying to get to me. Something was trapped in that mirror. The next morning, I decided to confront it. I had enough. I couldn't live in fear any longer. I told my mom I was going to move the mirror out of the house, but she insisted it wasn't necessary. "It's just an old piece of furniture, sweetheart," she said, brushing me off as usual. But I couldn't let it go. I needed to act. I went to the local church that afternoon, seeking out Father Collins, the priest who had helped with a few minor incidents in the area. When I told him what had been happening in our house, his expression turned serious. "You've been dealing with something dark," he said. "A demon or spirit may have latched onto that mirror. It's using it as a gateway." I told him everything, the whispers, the reflection, the voice, and he agreed to help. That evening, we returned to my house with Father Collins and a few others from the church. They performed a blessing, sprinkling holy water around the mirror and chanting prayers as they did so. I could feel the air growing heavier, thick with tension, as if the very walls of the house were holding their breath. As Father Collins began to chant, the temperature in the room dropped. The mirror started to shake violently, rattling against the wall. I heard the voice again, this time louder and angrier. "You cannot banish me," it screamed. But Father Collins didn't falter. He continued chanting, his voice unwavering. With one final prayer, he shouted, "By the power of God, I command you to leave." The mirror shook violently, then cracked. I watched in horror as the figure in the reflection screamed, its face contorting in agony before it vanished entirely. The mirror shattered, pieces falling to the floor with a deafening crash. The air in the house cleared, the heavy weight lifting from my chest. I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, as though the darkness had been lifted. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in weeks. The mirror was gone, destroyed, and with it, the malevolent presence that had haunted us. But I learned something that night. Some things are better left untouched. Some objects, especially old ones with dark histories, carry a power that we can't understand. And sometimes, when you look into the reflection, it's not just yourself you're seeing. It's something else, something that can reach out and take you. It was just supposed to be a family vacation, a getaway from the hustle and bustle of life, a chance to reconnect with my parents and younger sister. We rented a cabin in the woods, a place far from the city lights, with only the sounds of nature surrounding us. It was peaceful, quiet, and isolated, just what we needed. But little did I know that our perfect getaway would quickly turn into a nightmare I couldn't escape. The cabin was beautiful in its own way, rustic but charming, with wooden floors that creaked with every step and a stone fireplace that gave the living room a warm, cozy glow. My sister, Emily, and I chose our rooms upstairs. I got the room with the big bay window that overlooked the forest. The view was breathtaking, and I remember feeling an odd sense of calm as I unpacked my things. Emily, however, picked the room at the end of the hallway. It was smaller and had a door that led into an even smaller room that had no windows. It wasn't until the second night that I started to feel like something was off. I had just finished reading a book and was about to fall asleep when I heard something strange, faint whispers coming from the hallway. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the longer I listened, the more distinct the voices became. It sounded like murmuring, voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize. My heart skipped a beat, and I sat up in bed, straining to hear. I could make out Emily's voice, her soft laughter, and then something else, something darker, something that wasn't Emily. I jumped out of bed and ran into the hallway. My heart was pounding in my chest as I rushed to Emily's room. When I opened the door, I was met with an unsettling sight. Emily was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide open, staring at the wall. Her face was pale, and her breathing was shallow. But the worst part was that her voice was no longer her own. It was distorted, deep, grating. "Help me, they're coming," Emily whispered, her voice almost unrecognizable. I froze, my mind racing. What was happening to her? She had always been a prankster, playing jokes on me and our parents, but this wasn't one of her pranks. There was something wrong with her, something terrifying. "Emily?" I whispered, taking a tentative step toward her. She didn't respond. Her eyes remained locked on the wall, her body trembling slightly. And then, her voice, still not her own, spoke again. "They are here," it hissed, "and they will never leave." The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I stepped closer, trying to shake her awake. But it was no use. Emily didn't move. The room grew cold, and I felt an oppressive pressure in the air, like the space around me was being crushed by something unseen. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and a loud bang echoed from the hallway. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. My mind was spinning. What was going on? Was this some kind of sickness? Was Emily hallucinating? But the look on her face, there was nothing sick or normal about it. I ran downstairs to get my parents, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. My mom and dad rushed up the stairs with me, but when we reached Emily's room, the door was locked. We banged on it, but there was no answer. My mom screamed, her voice panicked, and my dad quickly kicked the door in. Emily was still sitting in bed, but now she was smiling. Not in a pleasant way, but in an unnatural, grotesque way. Her lips pulled back to reveal teeth that seemed too sharp, too perfect. "We're all going to die," Emily said, her voice still warped, as if two different people were speaking through her at once. I backed away, my heart racing, unable to speak, unable to move. My dad, in a frantic attempt to calm her down, tried to approach her, but as soon as he got close, Emily lunged at him with a strength that shouldn't have been possible. Her fingers dug into his arm with unnatural force, and he screamed in pain as he pulled away. "Stop!" I screamed, rushing forward, trying to pull her off, but it was like trying to move a rock. She was too strong. My mom grabbed her phone and dialed 911, but the call didn't go through. The signal was cut off. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if something dark was pressing in from all sides. And then, just as suddenly as it started, Emily went limp. Her head slumped forward, and the eerie smile disappeared from her face. She was breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling erratically. We all stood there in stunned silence, unsure of what had just happened. We decided to get out of the cabin. I didn't care if we had just arrived. I wanted to leave. My parents were equally terrified, and we piled into the car, ready to drive back to civilization. But as we turned the key in the ignition, something happened. The car wouldn't start. The engine sputtered and died. We tried again, but the same thing happened. That's when we heard it louder now. The whispers. They were coming from everywhere, swirling around us like a swarm of bees. I looked at Emily, whose eyes were wide open, staring at the back seat. But she wasn't looking at me. She wasn't even looking at anything I could see. Her gaze was fixed on something just beyond our reach, something that wasn't there. And then, in that quiet, tense moment, I saw it. In the reflection of the rearview mirror, there was a figure standing in the woods, just outside the cabin. It was tall and shadowed, its features obscured by the darkness, but its eyes, they were burning red. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The figure stepped closer, moving with an unnatural speed, until it was standing right behind the car, its face pressed against the window. I screamed, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. We tried to leave the cabin again, but this time, the car moved. Slowly, jerking forward as if pushed by some invisible force, it rolled toward the edge of the woods, and that's when I saw it again, the figure. It was standing in the driveway now, grinning, its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Its hands reached out, long fingers tapping on the window with a hollow sound. "Get out of the car," Emily's voice rasped, but it wasn't hers. It was deep and hollow, like something had taken over her. I couldn't move. My whole body was frozen in fear. I glanced at my parents. They looked just as terrified, their faces pale and eyes wide. My dad tried to start the car again, but the engine sputtered and died. The figure in the reflection grinned wider. "We are not leaving," the voice from Emily said, echoing in the car, cold and menacing. In that moment, I realized that Emily wasn't Emily anymore. Something had taken her, something dark, something ancient. It was in the woods, it was in the car, and it was inside her. The door slammed open. I heard footsteps behind me and spun around in terror. Standing there was a figure in a long black robe. His face was shadowed, but I could see his eyes, cold and empty. He reached out toward Emily, and the voice that came from her was no longer her own. It was something ancient, something malicious. "Leave her alone," I screamed, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, he raised his hand, and the air in the car seemed to freeze. The temperature plummeted, and I could see my breath as though we were outside in the dead of winter. But just as the figure stepped closer to Emily, I felt the air shift. Another presence filled the space, this one not dark, but light. A warmth that washed over me like a wave. The figure stopped in his tracks, his body stiffening as though something was holding him back. He let out a low growl, and the whispers around us grew louder, more frantic. The air shimmered, and suddenly, I heard the sound of a chant, a prayer, and in an instant, the figure was gone, vanishing into the air like mist. Emily collapsed forward, and I rushed to catch her. Her eyes were normal again, her breathing steady, but she had no memory of what had just happened. None of us could explain it, but the feeling of that dark presence, lingering, watching, never left. We left the cabin the next day, abandoning our vacation. To this day, I don't know what happened. Was it a demon? A curse? Some ancient force tied to the land? I'll never know. But one thing is certain. That cabin, that place, was not meant for humans. And neither was the black room Emily had stayed in. If you ever find yourself near those woods, don't go looking for the cabin. Don't go looking for the black room. Because some things are better left undisturbed. Some things should never be found. I grew up in a small town, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else. My family wasn't particularly religious, but we went to church on Sundays, like most people. It was a tradition, and the small, old church in the center of town always felt like a safe, peaceful place. I had no reason to question the history of the church or its past, but everything changed when I started working there. I was 19 when I began my job as the church's janitor. It wasn't a glamorous position, but it paid well enough for me to save up for college. I worked late hours, especially during the week when there were fewer visitors. I would spend my evenings cleaning the pews, sweeping the floors, and occasionally organizing the old storage rooms in the back. It was the kind of work that gave me plenty of time to think. The first strange thing happened during my third week working there. I was sweeping near the altar, the large wooden cross looming over me, when I heard a faint whisper. It sounded like a voice, but no one else was in the church. I paused, straining my ears to listen, but the sound faded. I brushed it off, thinking it was just the wind or an old floorboard creaking. That was the beginning of something far worse. The whispers started becoming more frequent. They were faint at first, just whispers in the distance, but over time they grew louder. Sometimes, I'd hear them from the back of the church. Other times they'd come from behind the altar. It was always a voice I couldn't understand, speaking in a low, guttural tone. The church was old, over 100 years, and I convinced myself that it was just the building settling. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. It wasn't long before I started seeing things, too. One evening, I was cleaning the back room near the church's small chapel. There was a long mirror in there, one of those old-fashioned types with a dark wooden frame. I was organizing a stack of books when I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection. It was quick, just a flicker, but I swear I saw a shadow move behind me. I turned around, but there was no one there. I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but as the days passed, the sightings continued. I would catch glimpses of figures in the reflection of mirrors, dark shapes moving in the corners of my vision. Each time I turned to look, the space would be empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was like something was always there, lurking just beyond my sight. One night, I stayed late to finish some cleaning. The church was eerily quiet, and the only sound was the soft shuffle of my broom sweeping the floor. I had just finished cleaning the back room when I heard something that froze me in my tracks. The unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed through the church. I stopped, my heart racing. No one was supposed to be there. The doors were locked, and the only people who came by at that hour were the occasional passerby. I peered into the main hall, but the church was empty. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and a cold chill swept over me. I turned to leave the back room, but as I did, I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, just a shadow, moving along the wall. It was tall, much taller than a person, and it had a presence that made my skin crawl. I knew that whatever it wasn't human. I grabbed my things and hurried toward the exit, but as I passed the altar, I heard a voice, clear this time, not a whisper, but a low growl. "Leave now." I nearly stumbled over my feet as I rushed out of the church, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. The voice echoed in my mind long after I had left. The next day, I went to the priest, Father Jacob. He was an older man, kind but serious, someone I trusted. I told him about the whispers, the footsteps, the shadows. At first, he seemed concerned, but he reassured me that it was probably just my imagination. The church was old, after all, and old buildings had a way of playing tricks on your mind. But when I mentioned the voice that had told me to leave, his expression changed. He didn't say anything for a long time. He just stared at me, as if deep in thought. Finally, he spoke. "There's something you should know about this church," he said quietly. "It has a history, a dark one." I didn't understand what he meant at first. He told me that the church had been built on land that had once belonged to a group of people with ties to the occult. A long time ago, the land had been used for rituals, dark and forbidden practices. Father Jacob explained that there had been rumors of a demonic presence in the church for years, but no one ever wanted to speak of it. They had tried to cleanse the church years ago, but it seemed like something had been left behind, something that was still waiting. I asked him what we could do, but he didn't have an answer. He told me that sometimes, in places like this, evil could linger long after the rituals had ended. Sometimes, it never left. That night, I stayed away from the church. I couldn't shake the fear that gripped me, the feeling that something was hunting me, that whatever was in that church wanted me to stay. I didn't sleep at all. The images of the shadow, the voice, haunted me, but I couldn't stay away forever. I had to work, and I knew I couldn't let fear control me. The next evening, I returned to the church. I was determined to finish my work and put the strange occurrences behind me. But when I entered the building, I immediately felt the change in the air. The temperature had dropped, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the floor. The church felt different, colder, darker. It was as though the walls themselves were closing in on me. As I made my way to the back room, I heard the whispers again. They were louder now, more frantic. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, desperate. It was as though the church itself was calling to me, urging me to stay, to become part of it. I reached the back room, but something was wrong. The mirror, the one I had seen the shadow in, was no longer where it should have been. It was gone. In its place, a dark shape stood, tall and looming. I could barely make out the figure's features, but I could see the red glow of its eyes staring back at me. "Leave," the voice whispered again. Only this time it was louder, more forceful. "Leave, or be taken." I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, and the air felt like it was pressing down on me. The shadows in the room seemed to twist and writhe, and I could feel the presence of something ancient, something powerful, watching me. Without thinking, I turned and ran toward the door. But as I reached for the handle, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. I was trapped. The voice grew louder, the whispers turning into a chant. "You cannot escape." I turned toward the altar, hoping to find a way out, but the church had changed. The walls were no longer familiar. The pews were overturned. The cross on the altar was twisted and broken. The air was thick with a palpable sense of dread. And then I saw it. A figure stood at the back of the church, its face hidden in shadow. It moved toward me slowly, its footsteps echoing in the silence. As it came closer, I saw its eyes, burning red, filled with malice. It was the same figure I had seen before, the shadow from the mirror. But this time, it wasn't in the reflection. It was real. The figure stopped in front of me, its mouth twisting into a grin. It reached out, its hand cold and clammy as it brushed against my cheek. "You should have left when you had the chance." Just as I thought it was going to grab me, I heard a voice, Father Jacob's voice, calling my name. The figure recoiled, and the air in the church shifted again. The temperature rose, and the whispers faded. The figure screamed, a horrible, ear-piercing sound, and then, with a flash of light, it disappeared. Father Jacob was there, standing in the doorway, holding a Bible and a crucifix. His face was pale, but his eyes were firm. "It's gone," he said. "It won't bother you again." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I was shaking too much, my heart racing in my chest. I had seen it with my own eyes, the demon, the shadow that had been haunting the church. I knew it wasn't over, but for now, it was gone. I quit my job at the church the next day. Father Jacob told me that the church would need a proper exorcism, a cleansing that might take weeks. But I knew that I couldn't stay there any longer. The shadows, the whispers, the demonic presence, it was too much. I never went back to that church, and to this day, I avoid the old buildings, the places where darkness has taken root. Because once you've seen something like that, you know that evil never really leaves. It lingers, waiting for the next person to wander in and become part of its curse. Growing up, I always thought I was immune to the supernatural. I never believed in ghosts or demons or anything that went bump in the night. Sure, I had seen scary movies, and I had heard the stories that others would tell around campfires or at sleepovers, but I always dismissed them as just that, stories. Nothing more. Nothing real. That was until we moved into the house on Ashbury Lane. We had been living in the city for most of my life, but when my dad's job transferred him, we decided to make the move to a quieter, smaller town. The house we found was charming, a two-story home on a quiet street. It wasn't huge, but it had enough space for our family of four, and the backyard had a tall oak tree I instantly fell in love with. The neighborhood was peaceful, and it seemed like the perfect place to start a new chapter. I remember walking through the house on the first day, the musty smell of old wood and dust filling the air. Everything seemed fine. The walls were painted a soft beige, the carpet worn but still soft underfoot. But there was something about the basement. My sister, Kelly, and I weren't allowed to go down there until we were older. Our parents said it was because it wasn't finished, but I always felt like there was more to it. The first time I really felt something was off was the night we moved in. It had been a long day, and by the time the furniture was mostly in place, the sun was setting. My parents were downstairs, finishing the last of the boxes, and Kelly and I decided to explore. We wandered into the living room, and as we passed the hallway that led toward the basement, I thought I saw a shadow move in the corner of my eye. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just the poor lighting. But the next time it happened, I couldn't ignore it. I was sitting in my room reading, and I glanced toward the hallway. At first, I thought it was a person walking by, but when I looked closer, I realized there was no one there. The shadow was taller than any of us, and it was darker than anything I had seen before, like it swallowed all the light around it. It stood perfectly still, just at the edge of the hallway, then slowly retreated into the shadows. I blinked, trying to convince myself that I was just tired, that my imagination was getting the best of me. But the longer I sat there, the more I felt like something wasn't right. I had to leave the room to get a drink of water, so I headed down the hallway and glanced toward the basement door. I swore I heard a soft whisper, a low, guttural sound coming from behind it. I froze, staring at the door. I didn't know why, but something told me not to open it, not to go anywhere near it. That night, as I lay in bed trying to fall asleep, I heard something again, a faint noise from downstairs. It sounded like something scraping along the floor. I sat up, listening. It was quiet at first, but then the scraping grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the direction of the basement. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. I had to know what it was. I stood up and quietly tiptoed to the stairs, leaning over the railing to listen. My heart was pounding, and I could barely breathe. The sound continued, louder now, as if something, or someone, was dragging itself across the floor below. My curiosity got the better of me, and I slowly made my way down the stairs. When I reached the bottom, I stood frozen in the dark hallway. The basement door was cracked open just a little. I reached out and pulled it fully open, but when I did, I was met with a cold rush of air. The house was silent now, the noise had stopped, but the chill that hung in the air sent a shiver down my spine. I turned the light on, and when I looked around the basement, I saw nothing. Nothing out of place. The old wooden beams in the ceiling creaked as they settled, the only sound in the house. But as I turned to leave, I saw it. In the corner of the basement, hidden in the shadows, there was a figure. It was tall and thin, with dark, matted hair hanging around its face. I couldn't make out any features, but I could see it moving. It wasn't walking. It was dragging itself closer, inch by inch, its limbs twisted in unnatural angles. I felt my blood run cold as I stared at it. My heart raced, and before I could think, I ran up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. I was shaking all over, my body frozen in fear. When I finally made it back to my room, I locked the door and crawled under the covers, hoping that when I woke up, everything would be normal again. But it wasn't. The figure had followed me. For the next few days, strange things started happening in the house. I would hear faint whispers at night, voices that seemed to come from nowhere. Sometimes, I would catch glimpses of something moving in the corner of my eye. It was always the same. A shadow, tall and looming, with those same twisted limbs dragging itself through the house. It never spoke, but it watched me, always watched me. One night, I woke up to find the figure standing in the doorway of my room. Its face was still hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me. It didn't move, but I could hear it breathing, low, raspy breaths that filled the room. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My voice was stuck in my throat. The next morning, I decided I had had enough. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran downstairs to my parents, telling them everything, but of course, they didn't believe me. They thought I was just scared, imagining things. They tried to comfort me, but the feeling of being watched never left. That afternoon, my sister Kelly came to me. She looked pale, her eyes wide with fear. "I saw it too," she whispered. "The thing in the basement." I felt a chill run down my spine. Kelly had seen it too. I wasn't crazy. We decided to go to the local library and look up information on the house. We found a dusty old book about the history of Ashbury Lane and the surrounding area. To my horror, we discovered that our house had once belonged to a family, one that had vanished under mysterious circumstances years ago. The family was rumored to have been involved in dark rituals, practices that involved summoning things from the other side. According to the book, the family's bodies were never found, but strange occurrences began happening to anyone who lived in the house after them. The more we read, the more we realized that the house was cursed. That night, Kelly and I sat in our room, terrified of what might happen next. We tried to keep our minds off the figure in the basement, but the whispers grew louder. It was as if the house itself was alive, feeding off our fear. We decided to take action. We had to confront whatever was in the basement, or it would continue to torment us. We gathered our courage and grabbed the flashlight. walking down the hallway toward the basement. When we reached the door, we hesitated, but then pushed it open. The basement was cold, colder than it had ever been. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, darker, and we heard the unmistakable sound of scraping again. This time, though, it was followed by a low, guttural growl, and then a voice. "Leave! Leave this place!" The figure emerged from the shadows. Its body was skeletal, its arms twisted, and its face. Its face was hollow, nothing but dark, empty sockets where eyes should have been. I froze in terror, unable to move. But Kelly, shaking but resolute, stepped forward. "We won't leave," she whispered. "We'll stay. We won't let you hurt us anymore." For a moment, everything went silent. The figure stood still, as if it were considering our words. Then, without warning, it lunged. But just as it did, the house seemed to shudder. The air thickened, the walls groaned, and the light above flickered violently. The figure froze in midair, as if an invisible force was holding it back. A voice, deep and commanding, echoed through the house. "Enough." The figure screamed, a sound that was both human and inhuman at once, and then it vanished. The coldness lifted, and the house was silent once more. From that night on, we never saw the figure again. The house slowly returned to normal, but I could never shake the feeling that something was still watching, still waiting. I don't know what happened in that house. I don't know if it was a demon, a ghost, or something else entirely. All I know is that whatever it wasn't welcome, and it never should have been. I never believed in demons, at least, not until I moved into that old house on Willowbrook Street. It was the kind of house that looked perfect on the outside. A sprawling two-story with a wide front porch, surrounded by an overgrown garden. But it had an unsettling feeling to it that I couldn't quite shake. My parents didn't see it, though. They were excited to move into a place so much bigger than our previous apartment, and the price was too good to pass up. The house had been vacant for years. It needed a lot of work. New paint, new floors, repairs on the roof. But it was a charming fixer-upper, the kind of place people daydream about restoring to its former glory. But from the very first day we moved in, I knew something wasn't right. It started with the sounds. At first, I thought it was the house settling. The old wood creaked in the night, the pipes groaned, and the wind would whistle through the cracks in the walls. But the sound soon became something more. It started with the whispering. One night, I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard it. A faint sound, coming from the wall next to my bed. At first, I thought it was the wind again, maybe a tree branch scraping the side of the house. But then the whispering became clearer, and it was coming from inside the wall. It wasn't the voice of a person. It was deep, raspy, and almost inhuman, like something was trying to speak through the plaster. I got out of bed and pressed my ear to the wall, but the whispering stopped the moment I did. I pulled away, feeling foolish, but as I lay back down, I could still feel the weight of it, like something was watching me. The next day, I mentioned it to my parents. Of course, they brushed it off, saying I was just hearing things. They were busy unpacking, and the last thing they wanted to hear was that I was scared of the house. But that night, the whispering came again. It wasn't just in the wall this time. It was everywhere. It filled the room, like it was coming from all directions. I could hear it just behind me, in front of me, even underneath me, as though the very foundation of the house was alive, pressing against me. "Help! Help me!" The voice seemed to be pleading, but there was something off about it, something that made my skin crawl. The words were garbled, like a voice speaking through water, but there was an undeniable sense of urgency in it. I threw the blankets over my head, trying to block out the sound, but it only grew louder. The whispering started to form into something more coherent. "Get out now." I didn't sleep that night. I just lay there, wide awake, listening to the oppressive silence that followed the whispers. The next day, I tried to forget about it. I tried to tell myself I was just imagining things, that it was a trick of the mind. But as the days went by, the strange occurrences continued. Objects would move on their own. Books would fall from shelves, furniture would shift, and doors would creak open by themselves. I started hearing footsteps, heavy ones, coming from the hallway when no one else was home. At night, the whispering would return, but now it was louder, more distinct. The voice began to grow more insistent, more demanding. You cannot stay here. You will not survive. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. The house was turning into a nightmare. I would go to sleep only to wake up to the sound of my name being called, and when I looked around, there was no one there. And then things began to get worse. I started seeing things. Strange, fleeting glimpses of dark figures moving in the corners of my vision. They were always just out of reach, always just at the edge of my sight, but I could feel them there, watching me, waiting for me. One evening, after dinner, I was alone in the living room. My parents were upstairs, and Kelly, my little sister, was outside playing with the neighbor kids. I sat on the couch, flipping through channels when I heard the unmistakable sound of scraping. It started from the back of the room and gradually got closer, like something was dragging itself across the floor. My heart pounded as I looked around the room, but there was nothing there. Still, the noise continued, and I could feel the cold draft filling the space, seeping under the door and through the cracks in the window. It was so cold that I could see my breath. I stood up and turned to face the hallway, my eyes fixed on the darkened door leading to the basement. That was when I saw it, a shadow, tall and thin, moving toward me from the darkness of the hallway. It wasn't a person. It was something far worse. It was like a shape, a form, but it didn't belong. Its limbs were twisted, almost broken, and its face, though I couldn't see it clearly, was just a dark, empty space. Before I could move, it lunged toward me. I screamed and ran to the stairs, but when I looked back, the shadow was gone. I ran straight to my parents' room, desperate for someone to believe me. My heart was racing, my hands trembling, but when I told them what happened, they only looked at me like I was losing my mind. My dad told me I was just stressed out, that the move had been hard on all of us. My mom tried to comfort me, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. They didn't believe me. I tried to tell myself they were right, that it was all just stress, maybe a figment of my imagination. But every night, the voices came again, louder, more demanding. The whispering turned to shouting, a guttural, primal scream that would pierce the silence of the night. I couldn't take it anymore. One afternoon, after I had finished my homework, I went into the basement. It was the one place I hadn't dared to explore. My parents had always told me to stay out, and I had never questioned it. But that day, something compelled me to go down there. I had to see what was causing all of this. I had to face it. The basement was damp and cold, with walls covered in peeling paint. The stairs creaked as I descended, and the further I went, the stronger the oppressive feeling grew. It was like the air itself was thicker down here, almost suffocating. When I reached the bottom, I turned on the light, but it flickered before going out completely. I stood in the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispering started again, but this time it wasn't just in my ears. It was coming from the walls themselves, vibrating through the concrete. Leave now. I reached out for the light switch again, my hands shaking, but as I did, I heard it scraping. That same scraping sound from the living room, only now it was right behind me. I turned around, but nothing was there. Then I saw it, the same dark figure from before, emerging from the shadows, moving slowly toward me. Its limbs were long and distorted, like they didn't belong to a human body. Its eyes were two black voids, empty and soulless. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. It felt like my body was frozen in place, and all I could do was watch as it drew closer. "You will stay," it whispered, its voice like a low growl that rattled my bones. "You will never leave." Just as it was almost upon me, the door at the top of the stairs slammed open, and I heard my mom's voice calling my name. "Tom, get up here. Now." I ran. I don't even remember how I got out of the basement, but I didn't stop until I was upstairs, breathless, shaking uncontrollably. My mom looked at me with concern, but when I tried to tell her what I saw, she couldn't understand. She didn't hear it, didn't see it. That night, I didn't sleep at all. The whispers were too loud, too terrifying. They filled the entire house, coming from the walls, the floors, the very air. I couldn't escape it. The next morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my bag, grabbed my jacket, and walked out of the house. I didn't care if my parents were angry. I didn't care if they thought I was being dramatic. I had to leave, or I was going to lose my mind. I never went back to that house on Willowbrook Street. I never spoke to my parents about it again. I moved in with a friend and later went to college. But to this day, I still hear the whispers sometimes, late at night when I'm alone. And every time I do, I think back to that house and the thing that was waiting for me inside the walls. I don't know what it was or what it wanted, but I know one thing for sure. It wasn't just my imagination. And I'll never forget the feeling of being watched by something that wasn't human, something that wanted to take me, to keep me there forever. If you ever find yourself near Willowbrook Street, don't go near that house. Because I can guarantee, whatever is inside, it's still waiting. I always thought I was immune to the paranormal. Growing up, I loved horror movies and ghost stories, but I never thought any of it could actually happen to me. I was too rational, too grounded in the real world to buy into the idea of demons, possessions, and exorcisms. That is, until I moved to St. Mary's. St. Mary's wasn't a town, it was a village. Tucked away in the hills, it felt like a forgotten place, with cobblestone streets and buildings that looked like they hadn't been touched in 100 years. I had no reason to be there. My family moved to St. Mary's because my dad got a new job at the old church, a job that was supposed to be temporary, just for a year. We thought it would be a nice quiet change of pace. But the village was strange. The locals were friendly, but they always had this odd way of looking at us, like they knew something we didn't. They would stare at me sometimes when I walked through the town square, whispering under their breath. I noticed that they never came to our house, never stopped by to introduce themselves. It was as if they were avoiding us, or maybe avoiding something in the air. It was unsettling, to say the least. One evening, I was walking home from the small convenience store, the only store in town, when I decided to take a shortcut through the church grounds. The sun had just set, and the light cast long shadows across the property. It was eerily quiet, except for the distant sound of wind through the trees. I passed the old bell tower and was about to head toward the path that led behind the church when I heard something. It was faint at first, like a low murmur coming from somewhere deeper in the church. But as I walked closer, I realized that the sound wasn't natural. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice. "Help me." I stopped in my tracks, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. It wasn't a whisper, but it wasn't a regular voice either. It had an unnatural quality to it, like it was coming from somewhere deep within the earth. I stood there for a moment, wondering if I was just imagining things. But then, the voice came again, clearer this time. "Help, please." I wasn't sure what to do. I should have walked away. I should have gone straight home. But something about that voice drew me in. It sounded desperate, scared, human, even if it was distorted. Without thinking, I walked toward the source of the sound, my feet moving on their own. As I reached the back of the church, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The door to the old church cellar, an area that was rarely used, was wide open. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it seemed impossible to miss. The voice was louder now, echoing up from the dark, stone steps that led down into the cellar. "Please, don't leave me here." I hesitated at the top of the stairs, the darkness below swallowing all light. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment, I thought about turning back. But the voice called to me again. There was no question in my mind anymore. Someone, or something, was down there. I descended into the cellar, my flashlight flickering as I moved deeper. The stone walls were cold, damp, and the air smelled musty, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. The stairs creaked beneath my weight, and the further down I went, the louder the voice became. "Help me, please, it hurts." I was sweating now, my heart racing. The voice sounded almost pained, like it was suffering. I turned a corner and froze. At the far end of the room, I could see a figure huddled in the shadows. It looked human, but its shape was wrong, twisted, unnatural. I took another step forward, but as I did, the figure shifted, standing up suddenly. It was tall, far taller than any person I had ever seen. Its arms were long, too long, and its face. I couldn't see its face. It was covered in shadows, but I could see the outline of a mouth, gaping wide, unnaturally wide. It opened its mouth and let out a low, guttural growl that made my blood run cold. "Get out!" I froze, paralyzed by fear. The voice wasn't pleading anymore. It was demanding, commanding. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. I could feel something pressing against me, something cold and malevolent. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. The figure began to step toward me, its limbs jerking unnaturally with each movement. I stumbled back, my mind trying to make sense of what was happening, but I couldn't. This wasn't human. This wasn't anything I understood. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. The stairs felt like they were miles away, the darkness closing in behind me. I made it back up the stairs and slammed the cellar door shut, gasping for air. I stood there, trembling, my back pressed against the door, listening for any sign that it was following me. But the cellar was silent again. The voice was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my room, wide-eyed and terrified, replaying the scene in my head. What was that thing in the cellar? Why did it sound like a person at first? Why had it tried to get me to come down there? The next day, I decided to do some research. I went to the library in the village, hoping to find something about the church's history or any previous strange occurrences. The librarian, a woman named Mrs. Hayes, was more than willing to help me, but when I asked her about the church's cellar, her expression changed. "You shouldn't be asking about that," she said quietly, looking around as though to make sure no one else could hear. "It's not something you need to know." Her reaction only made me more determined. I pushed her for information, but she refused to say anything else. She just handed me an old book about the church's founding and left me to read. I spent hours going through the book, but it wasn't until I got to the last chapter that I found something interesting. The book described how the church had been built on land that was rumored to have once been a burial ground for the town's earliest settlers. According to the book, there had been strange disappearances in the area and rumors of cult activity surrounding the church, dating back to the early 1800s. The church had been rebuilt several times, and each time, something had gone wrong. The last chapter, however, was the most chilling. It described an exorcism performed in the church in the 1920s. A man had been possessed, and the church had called upon a priest from a neighboring town to perform the ritual. The exorcism had failed, and the man had died in the church. His body was found in the cellar, his face contorted in terror. But it was what happened after the exorcism that made my blood run cold. The book mentioned that the priest had warned the villagers that the demon had not been expelled, but had instead taken root within the church itself. The villagers ignored the warning, but the priest's last words had been, "The demon will wait for the right person to come again." I couldn't believe what I was reading. The voice I had heard, the figure I had seen, it all fit. The demon had been waiting, and it had found me. I knew I had to leave St. Mary's. I had to get away from the church, from the village. But something deep inside me told me that it wasn't that simple. The demon wasn't just in the church. It was in the land, in the very air of St. Mary's. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the whispers again. They were faint at first, but then they grew louder. I could hear them all around me, echoing from the walls. "Help me." I sat up in bed, my heart racing. I tried to scream, but no sound came. I could feel the presence of something in the room with me, something cold and malevolent. The door to my room creaked open. I don't know how much longer I can stay in St. Mary's. Every day, I can feel the demon getting closer, its influence growing stronger. The village has become more and more hostile, the people avoiding me like they know something I don't. I don't know how much longer I can last, but I do know one thing. The demon isn't finished with me yet, and I don't know how much longer I'll be able to escape. It was a cold November evening when my life changed forever. I had always been a skeptic when it came to the supernatural. I loved horror films, ghost stories, and anything that made my heart race, but deep down, I never believed in demons, possessions, or anything beyond the world of science and reason. That all changed when I moved into the old house on Oak Hill. I had just turned 19 and was ready to strike out on my own. My parents were supportive, but didn't want me to go far. So, when I found the old two-story house on the outskirts of town, they weren't exactly thrilled, but they agreed it was a good fit for a college student like me. The house was cheap, and the rent was even cheaper. so it seemed like a perfect deal. I figured I'd stay there for a while, fix it up a bit, and save money on rent until I graduated. The house, however, had a history. The landlord, a reclusive older man named Mr. Webb, had lived in the house once, long ago, before moving to a nursing home. I had asked him if there was anything I should know about the place before moving in, but he had only given me a strange look and mumbled something about not staying past sundown. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't think much of it at the time. After all, who could expect a house to be anything but a house, right? But from the moment I moved in, things started to feel wrong. At first, it was little things, strange noises in the night, footsteps when I was the only one home, the faintest whispers just beyond the range of hearing. But as the days went on, the unease grew. The air in the house always felt thick, like something was pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. The rooms felt colder than they should have been, no matter how high I turned the thermostat. The attic door was locked when I moved in. Mr. Webb had told me it was for safety, but something about the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. It was only after a few weeks of living in the house that I decided to see what was up there. Maybe it was just some old junk he didn't want to get rid of, or maybe it was something more sinister. My curiosity got the better of me one evening, and I managed to get a spare key from the landlord. I climbed the stairs to the attic, feeling an inexplicable dread settle over me. The door creaked open with a force that seemed too loud for its own good, and I felt a sudden rush of cold air hit my face. The attic was dark, dusty, and smelled faintly of mold. Old wooden beams crisscrossed the ceiling, and piles of forgotten boxes filled the space. But it wasn't the clutter that caught my attention. It was the shadows. There was something about the way the darkness in the corners of the room seemed to move, like it wasn't just shadow, it was alive. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I stepped deeper into the attic, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned on the flashlight, hoping it would chase away the creeping feeling in my gut. That's when I saw it. In the far corner of the attic, half hidden behind a stack of old crates, was a large, ornate mirror. It was old, covered in dust, but there was something about it that made my heart skip a beat. I don't know why, but I felt drawn to it. The mirror was tarnished, the edges frayed, but it wasn't the mirror itself that was unsettling. It was the reflection in the glass. There was a shadow standing behind me. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat. There was nothing there. No one in the attic but me. But when I looked back at the mirror, the shadow was still there, right behind me. It was tall and thin, its features hidden in the dark. I could feel its eyes, dark, empty eyes, locked on me through the glass. I froze. I didn't know what to do. I should have run, but something held me in place. The air in the attic grew heavier, and the shadow in the mirror began to move. Its long, spindly fingers reached out, brushing against the glass as if trying to touch me. My heart raced as the shadow started to slowly step toward me. I stumbled back, tripping over a box as I ran for the attic door. I slammed it shut behind me, gasping for breath. My body was drenched in sweat, and I could feel my legs trembling. I had to get out of that house. But even though I left the attic behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. It wasn't long before I started seeing things. At night, when I would try to sleep, I would hear whispers, low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from the walls. Sometimes, I would wake up in the middle of the night, feeling like someone was standing at the foot of my bed, watching me. It wasn't just the whispers. There were other things, too. Objects would move on their own. Books sliding off shelves, chairs rocking back and forth without anyone sitting in them. The mirrors in the house would fog up, even though I had the heat turned off. When I looked into them, I didn't see my reflection. Instead, I would see that same shadow, standing just behind me, waiting. I was terrified, but I still didn't understand what was happening. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe I was just stressed out. But the longer I stayed in that house, the more convinced I became that something was wrong. The turning point came one night when I was sitting in the living room, trying to distract myself with a book. I had been hearing the whispers for days, but this time, they were louder. They weren't coming from the walls anymore. They were coming from the attic. The whispers grew into voices, then into screams, and I could hear the sound of scratching, like something was trying to get out of the walls. I grabbed my phone and called Mr. Webb. I told him I needed help, that I couldn't stay in the house anymore. But he was strangely calm when he answered. "I told you," he said, his voice almost too quiet. "It's not safe there. You need to leave before it's too late." Before I could ask what he meant, the line went dead. I ran to the attic door, my hands shaking as I tried to unlock it. I knew something was up there. I had to face it, had to know the truth. I opened the door, but the air in the hallway grew colder. As I stepped into the attic, the shadows seemed to twist and writhe around me, and the air felt thick with something I couldn't describe, something suffocating. The whispers became clearer now, calling my name. "Come closer. Join us." I backed away, my heart pounding, but then something caught my eye. The mirror was gone. The space where it had been was empty, except for a dark stain on the floor. That's when I felt it. A cold hand wrapped around my ankle, pulling me back toward the darkness. I screamed, kicking and scrambling, but the grip tightened. I looked down and saw it, the shadow. It had no body, just tendrils of dark smoke swirling around me, reaching for me. It was pulling me toward the mirror, toward the thing that had been waiting. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the attic, and the door to the room burst open. A man rushed in, his face pale with fear. It was Mr. Webb. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, his voice trembling. "I warned you. It's too late now." Before I could ask what he meant, he rushed forward, grabbing my arm. "We have to go now." But it was too late. The shadow was getting stronger, pulling me toward it, dragging me into the dark. Mr. Webb pulled out a small, old book from his jacket pocket, chanting something in a language I couldn't understand. The shadow recoiled, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't fast enough. I felt my body being pulled away, the darkness closing in. The last thing I remember before everything went black was Mr. Webb's terrified face. When I woke up, I was lying in my bed, drenched in sweat. The house was silent, but I knew it wasn't over. The house had claimed me. It had chosen me, and now I was part of it. The next morning, I found Mr. Webb's book on the floor, open to a page that read, "Once the demon marks you, it will never let you go." I haven't been able to leave the house since. I hear the whispers every night, and I see the shadow in the mirrors. It waits for me in the corners of my vision, just behind me, always there. And I know that it's only a matter of time before it drags me into the darkness forever. If you ever drive past Oak Hill, don't stop. Don't look at the house. Just keep driving. Because once the shadow has your name, it never lets go. It was late October when I moved into the old house on Elm Street. I'd been searching for a quiet place to get away from the city, somewhere peaceful to focus on my writing. The small town of Ashford seemed perfect. Nestled between tall oaks and dense forests, the area had an air of mystery and quietude that I found strangely comforting. Little did I know, that house, my new home, held secrets far darker than anything I could have imagined. The house itself was beautiful, old, but well kept, with a sprawling garden and large windows that let in the afternoon sunlight. It had a certain charm to it, like it had stories to tell, though there were things about it that made me feel uneasy, especially at night. At first, it was small things, a cold draft in the hallway, footsteps in the empty rooms, doors that creaked open on their own. But over time, these small events began to escalate. I had been there for a week when I first heard the whispers. It was late, around 2 a.m., and I had been up writing. I could hear the wind howling outside, but then I heard it, faint, like the rustling of dry leaves. It sounded like voices, but I couldn't make out the words. They seemed to be coming from somewhere deep within the walls. But when I turned to look, the house was still. I tried to dismiss it as my imagination, but the whispers continued for several nights in a row. One evening, the whispering stopped suddenly, and I was left in eerie silence. The air around me seemed to grow thicker, and I could feel an oppressive weight settle over the house. I was beginning to feel paranoid, like I wasn't alone, but it wasn't until I went into the basement that I realized just how wrong I was. The basement had always felt strange. It was dark, musty, and had an oppressive air that made it hard to breathe. There was an old wooden chest in one corner of the room, and every time I passed it, I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. One day, I decided to finally open it, convinced it was just a relic of the house's past. What I found inside, however, was far from ordinary. Inside the chest was a tattered old journal, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. The writing inside was barely legible, but I could make out some of the words. It was written by someone named Anna, who had lived in the house many years ago. The journal described strange occurrences, unexplained noises, shadows moving on their own, and feelings of being watched. But it was the final entry that made my stomach churn. The whispers will never leave. They follow me everywhere. I have tried to leave, but they keep pulling me back, dragging me into the darkness. I fear it is too late for me. The shadow is already here. As I read those words, I felt a sudden chill, and the room seemed to grow colder. The air thickened again, as if something was pressing down on me. I dropped the journal and backed away slowly. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more persistent. But this time, they weren't coming from the walls. They were coming from the attic. I had never ventured into the attic. I had seen the door to it, tucked away in the hallway, but I had never had a reason to go up there. Now, however, something told me that I needed to find out what was happening. I grabbed a flashlight, my heart racing as I made my way up the narrow stairs to the attic. As I reached the top, I could hear the whispers more clearly, almost like a chant. The sound was hypnotic, drawing me closer. I pushed open the attic door with trembling hands, the air growing colder the moment I stepped inside. The room was full of old furniture and forgotten belongings, but there, in the center of the room, was something that made my blood run cold. A large mirror, its frame ornate and decorated with strange symbols I didn't recognize. As I approached the mirror, I felt a pull, a strange sensation that made my skin crawl. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening. I looked into the mirror, expecting to see my reflection, but what I saw instead was something far worse. A figure stood behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The attic was empty, but the reflection in the mirror showed a tall, shadowy figure standing just behind me. Its face was obscured by darkness, but I could feel its eyes on me. I tried to step back, but my feet felt frozen to the floor. The figure in the mirror reached out toward me, its hand moving slowly, deliberately. "Come to me," the whisper came, now a voice, dark and hollow. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. The room seemed to spin around me, the whispers growing louder, more frantic. Then, without warning, the figure in the mirror lunged toward me. The next thing I remember, I was on the floor, gasping for air. I looked around, but the attic was empty. The mirror was gone. Everything was still. My head was spinning, and I had a strange, heavy feeling in my chest, like something was pressing down on me. I could still hear the faint whispering, but it wasn't coming from the mirror anymore. It was coming from inside my own head. I didn't sleep that night. The whispers became more persistent, always in the back of my mind, following me everywhere I went. I tried to go about my normal routine, but nothing felt normal anymore. The house felt different, like it was alive, like it was watching me. Shadows moved out of the corners of my vision, and I felt a presence that I couldn't explain. The next day, I decided to call someone, a paranormal investigator named Dr. Amelia Hart. She was known in the area for dealing with cases like mine, and though I was skeptical, I knew I had to do something. She agreed to come to the house the following evening. When she arrived, she immediately noticed the change in the air, the heaviness that had settled in the house. "This place is cursed," she said, her voice low and serious. "Whatever is here, it's not going to leave without a fight." Dr. Hart set up a few devices around the house to measure energy fluctuations, and we sat in the living room, waiting. As the night wore on, the air grew colder, and the lights flickered. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the whispers began again, more intense than before. "Do you hear that?" Dr. Hart asked, her eyes widening. "It's getting stronger. It's here." Suddenly, the door to the basement opened on its own. Dr. Hart stood up immediately, her face pale. "It's coming from there," she whispered. "We need to go down." We descended into the basement together, my heart pounding in my chest. The air was thick, and the whispers were now a cacophony of voices, all speaking in tongues. As we reached the bottom of the stairs, we saw something that made us both freeze. The mirror from the attic was there, standing against the wall. But now, it was cracked, the glass shattered in several places, and the symbols on its frame were glowing faintly with an eerie, unnatural light. "That mirror is a doorway," Dr. Hart said, her voice barely a whisper. "A portal. It's how the demon has been entering this world." Before I could react, the whispers grew into screams, and the temperature in the basement plummeted. The glass of the mirror began to warp, rippling like water, and a figure started to emerge from it. A tall, shadowy form with glowing red eyes, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. Dr. Hart moved quickly, pulling out a small vial of holy water and sprinkling it onto the floor. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice shaking with fear. The demon hissed, recoiling from the holy water, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it lunged toward us, its form shifting and changing. I screamed and ran, but the thing was faster, closing the distance in an instant. "Help me!" I cried out, but my voice was lost in the chaos. I could feel its cold fingers wrapping around my throat, squeezing the life out of me. I struggled to break free, but my strength was no match for it. Just as I thought I would be consumed by the darkness, Dr. Hart stepped forward, chanting words I couldn't understand. She held up a silver cross, and the demon let out a deafening scream. The air around us vibrated with an unnatural energy, and the demon's form began to disintegrate, fading into the shadows. The basement was silent again. Dr. Hart collapsed to her knees, breathing heavily. I stood there, trembling, as the last remnants of the demon disappeared into the darkness. "You were right," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It wasn't just in the house. It was in you. It had been waiting." From that moment on, I never set foot in that house again. Dr. Hart had told me that the demon would not be able to follow me, but the memory of those whispers still haunts me. And sometimes, just as I drift off to sleep, I hear them again, low, insistent, coming from somewhere deep inside my mind. The shadow may be gone, but it will never truly leave. It was a warm autumn evening when I arrived at the old, decrepit house nestled at the edge of town. My name is Sarah, and I've always had a deep fascination with the paranormal. For years, I'd heard rumors about the Hollow House, a crumbling mansion that had stood abandoned for decades. The house had a dark history. Its previous owners were rumored to have mysteriously disappeared, leaving only their decaying estate behind. They said it was cursed. Some believed it was haunted, while others whispered that something far darker resided within. Despite the warnings, I couldn't resist the temptation to explore. I had spent months researching the property, and when I finally got permission to visit, I couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and dread. I told myself I was prepared for whatever I would find, but I had no idea what I was about to face. The Hollow House stood tall and imposing against the backdrop of the setting sun. The thick vines creeping up its sides seemed to strangle the life out of it, as if the house was being consumed by something ancient and malevolent. The windows were shattered, the roof sagging, and the wooden door groaned on its hinges as I pushed it open. As I stepped over the threshold, an icy chill enveloped me. The air felt heavy, thick with a presence that made my skin crawl. I had brought my camera with me to document my findings, but I had no idea that I would soon be capturing something far more sinister than I had ever imagined. The inside of the house was dark, save for the light filtering through the broken windows. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, and the smell of mildew and decay filled the air. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, revealing the bare, rotting wood underneath. The house seemed to groan and whisper as if it were alive, responding to my presence in ways I couldn't understand. I moved deeper into the house, drawn by a strange pull in the air. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a sense of unease settled over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That's when I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from upstairs. My heart raced, and I instinctively reached for my phone to record the noise. I told myself it was just the house settling, but deep down, I knew it was something else. I hesitated for a moment, But then curiosity got the best of me. Slowly, I climbed the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The scratching grew louder, more urgent, as if something, or someone, was desperately trying to escape. I reached the top of the staircase and turned to the left, where a long, narrow hallway stretched before me. At the end of the hall, there was a door slightly ajar, a faint light spilling out from the crack. The scratching was coming from inside. My heart hammered in my chest as I walked toward the door. With each step, the air grew colder, the whispers louder. I could hear words now, but they were too soft, too distorted to make out. I reached for the doorknob and turned it slowly. The door creaked open, revealing a small room, its walls covered in strange markings. The floor was littered with torn pages, old books, and broken furniture. In the center of the room was a figure, hunched over, its back turned to me. The scratching sound was now unmistakable. It was coming from the figure itself. It was clawing at the floor, its hands twisted and malformed, scraping desperately at the wooden planks. Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure froze. Slowly, it turned its head toward me. I could see its face now, pale, gaunt, and twisted in a grotesque expression of pain. Its eyes were wide, empty sockets, as if something had hollowed out the soul within. Its lips parted, and in a voice that was not its own, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come." The voice was low, guttural, and layered with something unnatural, like multiple voices speaking in unison. A shiver ran down my spine as the air in the room seemed to grow colder. The figure slowly stood up, its limbs moving in jerky, unnatural motions. Its mouth opened wide, revealing sharp, yellow teeth that gleamed in the dim light. Suddenly, it lunged at me. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. The figure was faster than I could react, its bony hands grabbing at my shoulders, pulling me closer. I struggled, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but I couldn't break free. I felt its cold, clammy fingers tighten around me, and I knew then that whatever this thing was, it wasn't human. A voice in my head screamed at me to run, to escape before it was too late. But something held me in place. An invisible force, a grip that was stronger than anything I could comprehend. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me, filling my mind with incoherent words, as if hundreds of voices were speaking all at once. And then, as if from nowhere, a bright light illuminated the room. I blinked, momentarily blinded, and when I opened my eyes, the figure was gone. The room was empty, the air still, and the scratching had stopped. I was left standing there, my heart pounding in my chest, drenched in sweat. I couldn't understand what had just happened. Had it all been a hallucination? A trick of the mind? But the fear in my gut told me it was real. I stumbled out of the room, desperate to escape. As I made my way back down the hallway, I felt the house shift beneath me. Like the walls were closing in, the air growing heavier with each step. The whispers followed me, growing more frantic, and I could feel something hot on my heels, something chasing me through the house. I reached the staircase and bolted down, my feet stumbling over the uneven floorboards. I couldn't get out fast enough. When I finally reached the front door, I wrenched it open and ran outside, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The chill in the air seemed to cling to me, as if the house itself had marked me. I turned back, looking at the hollow house one last time, but what I saw made my blood run cold. There, in one of the broken windows on the second floor, I saw a figure standing, its face pale and twisted, its eyes staring directly at me. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling my ears with their cold, malicious sound. And then the figure smiled. It wasn't human. It wasn't even alive. It was a thing born from darkness, a force that had been waiting for someone like me to step into its grasp. I ran back to my car and drove away, not stopping until I reached the safety of my apartment. But even now, months later, I still feel it. The whispers haunt my every moment. The shadow of that thing from the hollow house still lurks in the corner of my vision, just beyond my reach. And when I close my eyes at night, I hear it again. The scratching, the low murmurs, and the terrible, distorted voice telling me I shouldn't have come. The hollow house is still there, waiting for its next victim. And once it claims you, there is no escape. If you ever hear the whispers calling your name, run. Run as far and as fast as you can. Because once it has you, it will never let you go. I never believed in the supernatural. I had always been the skeptic in my group of friends, dismissing the spooky tales and ghost stories as mere superstition. But everything changed the day I met Emily and the day I found the doll. It all started when my aunt, who lived in the countryside, passed away. She had been battling cancer for years, and her death, though expected, still left a hole in my heart. She was my mother's younger sister, a vibrant woman full of life who always had a story to tell. I had spent many summers at her house as a child, playing in the garden and listening to her mysterious tales of old family secrets and ghostly encounters. As strange as it sounds now, she had always been a little odd. But I loved her dearly, and when she passed, I inherited some of her belongings, including an old, wooden box she had kept in her attic. When I first opened the box, I wasn't sure what to expect. There were old letters, dusty journals, and strange trinkets that seemed to have little value. But one item caught my eye, a doll. It was small, with porcelain skin and glassy blue eyes that seemed to follow me around the room. The doll was dressed in an old-fashioned lace dress and had golden curls that framed its pale face. It looked like something out of a Victorian horror film, and at first, I thought it was just an old collectible. But there was something unsettling about it, something that sent a chill down my spine. I had never seen the doll before. My aunt hadn't mentioned it, and none of her other belongings seemed to indicate she had ever been interested in dolls. But there it was, sitting at the bottom of the box, its glassy eyes staring directly at me. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that crept over me and decided to keep the doll as a memento, thinking it was just my imagination. After all, I had never experienced anything supernatural in my life. Why should I start now? That night, I placed the doll on my nightstand and went to bed, trying to forget about it. But as I lay in the darkness, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the doll's appearance. It was the way it made me feel, as if something dark and malevolent was lurking nearby, waiting to make its presence known. I tossed and turned, unable to sleep, but eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off. I woke up in the middle of the night, my heart racing. The room was pitch black, save for the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the curtains. I lay still for a moment, listening, but all I could hear was the sound of my own breath. Then, I heard something else, a faint scratching sound, like fingernails on wood. My eyes snapped open, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me. I turned toward the nightstand, my breath catching in my throat. The doll was gone. Panic surged through me as I searched the room, my eyes darting around in the dark. Where could it have gone? I had seen it clearly on the nightstand when I had gone to sleep, but now it was nowhere to be found. My pulse quickened as I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up, my bare feet touching the cold wooden floor. I turned on the lamp, and there, sitting at the foot of my bed, was the doll. It was positioned upright, its porcelain face staring at me with an expression that I can only describe as sinister. The same cold chill from earlier returned, and I felt an icy knot form in my stomach. How had it gotten there? I hadn't heard anything, no footsteps, no shifting of fabric. It was as if the doll had moved on its own. I shook my head, trying to convince myself that I was just imagining things. But the sense of dread that clung to me wouldn't go away. I grabbed the doll and threw it back into the wooden box, slamming the lid shut with trembling hands. I told myself that I needed to forget about it, that it was just a coincidence. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That night, I tried to sleep, but I was restless. The whispers started then, soft, barely audible at first, but growing louder with each passing minute. At first, I thought it was just the wind outside, or perhaps my overactive imagination. But soon, the whispers became clearer, and I realized they were coming from the direction of the box. My heart stopped as I turned my head toward the corner where the box sat. The whispers were now accompanied by a faint giggling, the kind of eerie sound you hear in your worst nightmares. I must have fallen asleep at some point, but when I woke up, I found myself sitting on the floor, surrounded by pieces of the broken box. The doll was gone again. I felt a scream rising in my throat as I looked around, but this time, I didn't need to search the room. I already knew where it was. The doll was sitting on my chest, its cold, lifeless eyes staring down at me as if it had been waiting for me to wake up. Terrified, I jumped out of bed and ran out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I spent the next few days trying to avoid the doll, keeping it locked away in the attic as I convinced myself that I was just experiencing stress and grief from my aunt's death. But no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the doll's presence haunted me. The whispers never stopped. They followed me wherever I went, growing louder and more frantic each day. The doll seemed to want something from me, and whatever it was, I had no intention of giving it. But that didn't stop it. The night I finally left the house, I decided to burn the doll. I had had enough. I couldn't live in a place where I was tormented by the whispers and the cold, lifeless stare of that cursed thing. I took the doll out of the box and placed it in the fireplace, watching as the flames licked at its porcelain face. For a brief moment, I felt a sense of relief. But then, something happened that made my blood run cold. The doll's eyes moved. It wasn't just a trick of the light, or my mind playing games with me. The doll's eyes shifted, and for the briefest moment, they seemed to lock onto mine. A cold, deep laugh echoed in my mind, and the whispers grew louder than ever, drowning out my thoughts. Suddenly, the room filled with a chilling wind, and I heard a voice, low, guttural, and full of malice. "You can't escape me, Sarah." I stumbled backward, my heart racing in my chest. The flames roared higher, but the doll didn't burn. It stood there, untouched by the fire, its eyes never leaving me. The room grew darker, colder, and I could feel something closing in, something sinister that I couldn't see but could feel in every fiber of my being. I ran from the house, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. I didn't know what had happened to the doll, but I knew I had to get as far away from it as possible. I never went back to my aunt's house, and I never spoke of the doll to anyone. I couldn't explain it, and I didn't want to. To this day, I don't know what that doll was or what it wanted from me. All I know is that sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I hear the whispers again. They call my name, soft at first, but growing louder, more desperate. I don't dare look back, because I know if I do, the doll will be waiting. And it will want more than just my attention. It will want my soul. So, if you ever come across an old, strange doll, one that seems to stare just a little too long, remember my story. Don't take it home. Don't give it any part of your life, because once you do, there's no escaping its grasp. It's already watching you. I never believed in ghosts. I never believed in anything paranormal, for that matter. I thought it was all just stories made up to scare people. That was until I moved into the old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. It was cheap, isolated, and the kind of place where no one would bother me. I needed a fresh start after a rough patch in my life, and the house, with its peeling paint and creaky wooden floors, seemed perfect. I didn't mind that it was old or that it had a few cobwebs. I just wanted to get away from everything. But as soon as I moved in, I began to feel like something wasn't right. It started subtly. At first, I just noticed small things. A door that wouldn't quite close, the feeling of being watched when I was alone, strange noises at night that sounded like whispers. But I was used to living alone, and I convinced myself it was just the house settling, or the wind rattling the windows. One evening, I decided to explore the basement. I had been avoiding it, but there was something about it that seemed to draw me in. The door was old and heavy, creaking on its hinges when I opened it. The stairs led down into the dark, and I could feel the temperature drop as I descended. The basement smelled musty, like old wood and mildew. Nothing too unusual, I thought. It was an old house, after all. But as I explored the dusty, dimly lit space, I found something that made my stomach churn. In the far corner, partially hidden behind a stack of old furniture, was a large wooden chest. It was covered in dust and cobwebs, and it had an eerie, almost unsettling feel to it. Something about the chest seemed wrong. I felt an overwhelming urge to open it, but a part of me resisted. Still, Curiosity got the better of me, and I pried it open. Inside, I found a collection of old, tattered books and strange objects, candles, ritualistic knives, and what looked like a piece of human bone. There were also drawings, scrawled symbols, diagrams, and words written in a language I didn't recognize. The air in the basement felt heavier, colder, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I slammed the chest shut, my breath quickening as I backed away from it. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't sleep. The house seemed to groan with strange noises, creaks from the floorboards, and faint whispers that I couldn't quite place. As I lay in bed, trying to block out the unsettling sounds, I heard it again, a voice. Soft at first, almost a whisper, but growing louder, more distinct. "Help me." I sat up straight, my heart racing. The voice sounded like it was coming from downstairs, from the basement. I told myself it was just my imagination, but something in my gut told me it wasn't. The voice sounded desperate, pleading, like someone was trapped. Against my better judgment, I got out of bed and crept downstairs. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the old wooden floor. When I reached the basement door, I froze. The voice was clearer now, and it sounded like it was coming from the chest. "Help me, please." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. My hands trembled as I reached for the doorknob and slowly turned it. The basement door creaked open, and I descended the stairs once again, my feet feeling heavier with each step. The air was colder this time, and the whispers seemed to surround me. I turned on the light, but it flickered erratically, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. As I approached the chest, I could hear the voice clearly now. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was full of desperation, a sound of anguish that made my blood run cold. "Please let me out." I reached for the chest, but before I could open it, the lights in the basement flickered violently and went out. I was plunged into darkness. I stood frozen, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to calm myself, but then I heard it, the sound of something moving in the dark. It was slow at first, a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. I could feel my pulse racing, my palms sweating. "Help me." The voice was closer now, and I knew it wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me. The voice was real, and it was coming from inside the chest. I turned and ran toward the stairs, my feet stumbling over the uneven floor. I made it halfway up when I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, like something was following me, getting closer with each passing second. I reached the top of the stairs and slammed the basement door shut, panting, my body trembling with fear. I didn't know what I had just experienced, but I knew I couldn't go back down there. I didn't know what was in that chest, but it was evil, something dark and powerful that I wasn't prepared to face. The next day, I decided to leave the house. I packed my things, determined to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. But as I was about to leave, I noticed something strange, an old, weathered book on the floor of the living room. I hadn't seen it before. It was the same type of book I had found in the basement, and it was open, as if someone had been reading it. I opened the book to the first page, my hands shaking. The pages were filled with strange symbols and drawings, much like those I had seen in the basement. I flipped through the pages, my heart pounding in my chest as I read the words. It was an incantation, a ritual meant to summon something dark, something demonic. And as I read the last words, I felt a sudden, overwhelming pressure on my chest, as if something was watching me, waiting. That's when I heard it, the voice again. "Get out." I spun around, but the house was empty. I had no idea where the voice was coming from, but it was everywhere now. Inside my head, in the walls, in the very air I breathed. The whispers became louder, more frantic, and I could feel something cold and malevolent closing in on me. I didn't waste another second. I grabbed my things and left the house, not looking back. But even as I drove away, I could still hear the voice, calling out to me, following me. That was weeks ago, but I still hear it sometimes. In the dead of night, I hear the whispers. They call my name, and I know that whatever was trapped in that basement, whatever I disturbed when I opened that chest, is still out there, waiting. It hasn't let me go. I don't know what it is or what it wants, but I've learned one thing. There are things in this world that should never be disturbed, things that should never be brought into the light. Because once you do, they'll find a way to come for you. And when they do, there's no escape. I've always been a skeptic. My family was religious, but I never bought into any of the ghost stories they told or the superstitions they clung to. I was practical, grounded in reality. But all of that changed the night I moved into my new apartment, a tiny one-bedroom on the edge of town. It was cheap and seemed perfect, quiet, away from the chaos of the city, and big enough for just me. What could go wrong? The apartment had an old feel to it, with thick wood trim and vintage light fixtures, but nothing that made me nervous. I spent the first few weeks settling in, arranging my furniture, unpacking boxes, and painting the walls. Everything felt normal. However, that all changed when I discovered the mirror. It was a beautiful piece, framed in antique brass with intricate designs, something that looked like it belonged in a museum. I found it tucked away in the back of one of the closets, hidden behind a stack of old blankets. I thought it was a little odd that the landlord would leave such a nice mirror tucked away, but I wasn't going to question it. I hung it in my hallway near the bathroom, where it would catch the light in a way that made the whole room look brighter. At first, nothing seemed strange. The mirror reflected my own image, the soft lighting of my apartment, and the casual, everyday mess that most young adults live with. But as the days went by, I started to feel uneasy. It began with small things. I'd catch glimpses of movement in the corner of the mirror. It would be nothing at first, just a flicker of shadow or the shape of something that wasn't quite right. I convinced myself it was just the light playing tricks or my mind running wild. But it wasn't long before the reflections started to feel different. One evening, I came home late after a long day of work. The apartment was quiet, and I was exhausted. As I walked past the mirror in the hallway, I looked up and froze. I could see my reflection, as I always did, but there was something else, a shadowy figure standing behind me. I whipped around to find the hallway empty. No one was there. Yet, in the mirror, the figure remained. It was tall, almost unnaturally so, with long arms and a face that was hard to make out. I squinted, trying to understand what I was seeing. The figure seemed to shift, like it was moving, but not physically, more like a dark patch that stretched and writhed in the reflection. I blinked hard, and when I looked again, it was gone. My heart raced, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just seen something I wasn't supposed to. I thought it was a trick of the light or my imagination, but over the next few days, the feeling of unease grew stronger. I started to avoid the hallway mirror, not wanting to face whatever I had seen. But no matter how much I tried to ignore it, the odd reflections kept happening. It was one night, several weeks later, when I finally couldn't deny it any longer. I had come home again, tired and cranky, and had gone straight to the kitchen to make myself some dinner. As I was pulling a pot out of the cabinet, I caught a glimpse of movement in the hallway, out of the corner of my eye. This time, I didn't hesitate. I turned quickly, and there it was, the figure from before, standing in the hallway mirror, clear as day. But this time, the figure wasn't just standing there. It was moving toward me. Slowly, the figure raised its hand, its long fingers stretching unnaturally. I could see the outline of its face now, distorted, twisted, like something out of a nightmare. The face was pale, its eyes sunken, hollow, and dark. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran straight out of the apartment, slamming the door behind me. I stood outside in the cold night air, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew that something wasn't right. The next few days were a blur. I called my friend Emily, who had always been the more spiritual one in our group, hoping she would have some kind of explanation. She didn't waste any time. She came over that same night with a small bag of salt, candles, and a few other items I couldn't quite identify. She told me I was dealing with something darker than just a shadow, something demonic. At first, I laughed it off. Demonic? You've got to be kidding. It's just a mirror. It's an old apartment. Maybe there's some weird energy here, but trust me, she interrupted, her voice low and serious. It's not just a shadow. You're being watched by something that doesn't belong in this world. That night, Emily set up candles around the mirror and began chanting softly in a language I didn't understand. She told me that I needed to stay calm and not look directly into the mirror, that whatever was trapped inside would only get more powerful if I focused on it. She said the mirror was cursed, that it had once belonged to a woman who had gone through a horrific exorcism after being possessed by a demon. The demon had been banished, but it left a piece of itself behind, trapped in the glass. As Emily chanted, I watched the mirror closely. The room grew colder, the shadows in the corner of the mirror deepened, and then the air seemed to thicken. The reflection of the room began to distort, like the surface of a pool of water disturbed by ripples. The figure in the mirror started to move, and I could feel its gaze on me. It was like it knew I was there, watching it. Suddenly, Emily gasped and dropped the candle she had been holding. "It's trying to get out." I didn't wait for any more explanation. I ran out of the apartment again, my breath coming in sharp gasps. Emily followed me, but I could hear the voice now, deep and guttural, echoing through my mind. It was a whisper, yet it felt like it was roaring inside my skull. "Come back." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that twisted face, those dark, hollow eyes staring at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the demon was still in the apartment, waiting for the right moment to strike. The next morning, I called a local priest, desperate for any help. He arrived that afternoon, a kind, older man named Father Thomas. I told him everything, the mirror, the figure, the strange occurrences. He listened patiently, but I could tell he wasn't surprised. "I've dealt with this kind of thing before," he said quietly. "Demons can attach themselves to objects. Once they do, they use those objects to manifest and influence the living. But don't worry, we'll take care of it." Father Thomas brought a few holy items with him: blessed water, a crucifix, and a small vial of holy oil. Together with Emily, they performed a ritual in the apartment, chanting prayers and spreading the holy water around the mirror. At first, nothing happened. The air felt heavy, but the figure didn't appear. Then, suddenly, there was a loud bang, and the mirror cracked down the center, as if something inside had struck it. The figure's face appeared, twisted in rage. The air turned cold, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. Father Thomas stood firm, continuing the prayers with unwavering strength. "In the name of Christ, I command you to leave," he shouted. The figure in the mirror seemed to recoil, its face contorting in pain. Finally, with a loud crack, the mirror shattered completely, and the temperature in the room returned to normal. The figure was gone. Father Thomas explained that the demon had been banished from the mirror, but it wasn't truly gone. It would find another way to enter this world if given the chance. The best thing I could do was get rid of the mirror, destroy it completely and never look back. I did just that. I had the mirror thrown away and took the advice Father Thomas gave me. I stayed far away from that apartment after that night. I moved in with Emily for a while, and I never looked at a mirror the same way again. Looking back, I can't explain what happened or why it happened to me, but I learned that some things in this world are beyond our understanding, things that shouldn't be disturbed, things that don't belong here. If you ever find an old mirror, especially one with a strange, unsettling history, don't make the mistake I did. Some reflections are better left unseen. You never know what might be watching you, waiting for you to look. It was a dreary Wednesday evening when I first heard about the chapel. My friend, Mike, had always been the adventurous type, dragging me to abandoned places and telling me the wildest stories. But this one felt different, even though he didn't know much about it. He only knew what people said, a few hushed whispers at the pub, rumors that had been passed down for decades. St. Margaret's Chapel, just on the outskirts of town, was a place locals avoided. No one knew exactly why, but most didn't question it. Even the most skeptical people seemed to have a certain unease when the chapel came up in conversation. That evening, Mike told me, "It's supposed to be haunted, you know, by something worse than a ghost." He was grinning, as if this was just another one of his jokes. But there was something in his voice that made me pause. I wasn't afraid of ghosts, or at least, I didn't think I was. But this wasn't a typical place. Mike and I had been friends since high school. He was always the one to convince me to do something reckless, and I'd always been the one to back him up. This time, though, I wasn't sure. But my curiosity got the best of me. Haunted? By what, exactly? The locals think it's something worse, he said, his voice trailing off. I've heard whispers about people who've gone there and not come back the same. I laughed it off, but Mike wasn't joking. He'd always been into the paranormal, so when he said something like this, I couldn't ignore the tone in his voice. So, after a few hours of convincing and his promise of just a quick look, we set out for St. Margaret's Chapel. When we arrived, the chapel was shrouded in mist, the moonlight barely piercing through the thick clouds. It was a small stone building, perched on a hill, surrounded by overgrown grass and trees that seemed to lean toward it, as if shielding it from the outside world. The windows were dark, the iron gate creaking in the wind. The entire place felt abandoned, yet alive in a way I couldn't explain. I turned to Mike, who was already walking toward the chapel, his steps eager, almost too eager. We shouldn't be doing this, I muttered, but he didn't seem to hear me. Come on, what's the worst that could happen? He called back, a grin plastered on his face. I followed him inside, my nerves on edge. The moment we stepped through the door, a chill ran down my spine. The air inside was thick with dust, and the heavy smell of old wood and mildew filled the space. A small altar stood in the center, covered in what appeared to be remnants of old candles, and the floor was cracked, the tiles uneven. The silence was deafening. Mike pulled out a flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, and we began exploring. The chapel was small, but it felt vast in the way the air seemed to press in on us. As we moved deeper into the interior, I noticed the odd carvings on the stone walls, symbols, marks I didn't recognize. Some of them were beautiful in a terrifying way, while others seemed jagged and raw, as if they had been etched by something inhuman. I shivered. Hey, look at this, Mike called out, his voice excited. He had found something in the back corner. What looked like an old altar, much larger than the one in the front. It was covered in dust, but there were strange markings on it. The floor around the altar was littered with old, dried flowers and what looked like burnt remnants of paper. As Mike knelt down to get a closer, look, I couldn't shake the feeling that we shouldn't be there. We should leave, I said, my voice low, but Mike ignored me. Why? It's just an old chapel, he said dismissively, but I could hear the hesitation in his voice. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then I realized it wasn't. A shadow moved across the back of the chapel, something tall, too tall, moving toward us. It didn't belong. I froze, unable to look away as it moved through the shadows, as if it were stepping into the room from a different world. Mike, I whispered, but my voice barely made a sound. He didn't hear me. The shadow stopped behind him, and I could feel its presence, heavy and suffocating. The air felt colder, and I could almost hear something. Whispers, low and guttural, that seemed to come from every corner of the room. My heart pounded in my chest. Something was wrong. And then Mike screamed. It wasn't a normal scream. It was full of terror, agony, a sound that didn't belong to him. I turned around to see him on the ground, clutching his chest. His face was pale, his eyes wide with horror, and he was gasping for air as if something was crushing him from the inside out. Mike, I shouted, rushing to his side. But he couldn't hear me. His eyes were unfocused, staring straight ahead at something I couldn't see. The whispers grew louder, and I realized, with growing horror, that they were coming from Mike. His mouth wasn't moving, but the words were spilling out of him, words in a language I didn't understand. The sounds were harsh, inhuman. I tried to pull him to his feet, but it was like trying to move a statue. He was rigid, his body unnaturally stiff. That's when I saw the figure, standing just behind him, in the shadowy corner of the room. It was tall, hunched over, its face hidden in the dark, but I could feel its eyes on me, piercing through me like ice. It moved closer to Mike, and I couldn't stop it. I tried to reach for him, but a force, cold, ancient, and terrifying, pushed me back. I stumbled, falling to the floor, and that's when I saw it. The thing's face. It was horrifying, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes and a mouth twisted into a permanent snarl. It wasn't human. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist. Mike's body jerked violently, his hands clawing at his throat as if trying to tear something away. His eyes were still wide, but they were no longer his own. They were filled with something dark, something ancient. The whispers continued, echoing through the room, louder now. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Mike's body went limp, his chest still, his breathing shallow. The figure in the corner faded away, melting back into the shadows like smoke. I rushed to Mike's side, shaking him, but there was no response. His eyes were closed, his body cold. I was about to give up, about to scream for help, when suddenly, his eyes shot open. But they weren't his eyes anymore. The voice that came from his mouth was not Mike's. It was deep, guttural, and full of malice. "You shouldn't have come here," it hissed. "You've awakened it." I stumbled back, my blood turning to ice as Mike. "No." It stood up, its body shifting unnaturally, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. The air around us crackled with a dark energy. I ran. I ran out of that chapel faster than I'd ever run in my life. I didn't stop until I was back at my car, breathing hard, my heart hammering in my chest. But even as I drove away, I could still hear the whispers, faintly, in the back of my mind. When I called the police the next day, the chapel was gone. Just like that, vanished from the hillside. There were no signs of the building, no trace of it. It was as if it had never existed. Mike, he's different now. He's not the same person I knew. He doesn't talk about what happened, and when I ask, he just stares at me with those hollow, dark eyes. It's as if it is still there, still with him. I don't know what we disturbed that night, but I know one thing for sure. Some places are cursed for a reason, and some things, once awakened, will never let you go. It was a few years ago when I moved to the small town of Black Hollow, a place so quiet and tucked away that most people only pass through it on their way to somewhere else. The air smelled of fresh pine and damp earth, the kind of place where people seemed to know each other's business but kept to themselves. I didn't mind it much. It was peaceful, and I was looking for a fresh start. My life had been a whirlwind before I came here, and I hoped the solitude would offer me a sense of clarity. But Black Hollow wasn't the simple town it seemed to be. It had its secrets, secrets I was too naive to notice at first. I first heard about Black Hollow's dark history from the locals, but it wasn't until a strange event that I truly understood what they meant. The townspeople were always careful when they talked about Black Hollow Forest, a dense patch of woodland that lay just beyond the town's edge. They whispered about it in hushed tones, their eyes darting to the ground, and I thought they were just exaggerating. People love a good ghost story. After all, the more I asked about the forest, the more the answers became vague and unsettling. "Don't go near it," they would say. "There's something wrong with that place." Some would mention an old, abandoned church deep in the woods, but no one would ever talk about it in detail. It was as if they were afraid to say too much. One evening, curiosity got the best of me. After weeks of hearing the same rumors, I decided to take a walk in the forest. The day had been unusually warm, and the sun was just beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the trees. It seemed like the perfect time to explore. So, I grabbed my flashlight, put on my boots, and set out toward the forest. The path was easy to follow at first, a small dirt trail that snaked its way through towering trees and thick brush. But as I ventured deeper into the woods, the feeling of isolation began to creep over me. The air was damp, and the sunlight barely filtered through the canopy, making the shadows darker than they should have been. I felt eyes on me, but when I looked around, I saw nothing. It was the kind of unease that I couldn't explain, the kind that gnawed at the pit of your stomach and made every little sound seem far too loud. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. Even the birds and insects seemed to vanish, leaving only the distant rustling of the wind. My heart began to race. I was beginning to regret my decision, but something almost magnetic, kept pushing me forward. After what felt like hours of walking, I stumbled upon an old stone structure, half hidden by overgrown vines and moss. It was the church, the one the townspeople had whispered about. Its crumbling walls and broken stained glass windows made it look ancient, forgotten by time. The church sat in eerie silence, its door slightly ajar, as if inviting me in. I don't know why I stepped inside. Maybe it was the allure of the unknown, or maybe it was just my growing sense of dread that compelled me to investigate. But as soon as I crossed the threshold, I felt a cold chill in the air. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, and my breath came out in small clouds of mist. The walls of the church were lined with rotting pews, their wood warped and cracked. The smell of decay lingered, thick and foul. I walked further inside, my flashlight barely cutting through the gloom. And that's when I saw it, on the altar, a figure. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, something my eyes were playing tricks on. But as I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't a shadow at all. It was a person, but not a person like any I had ever seen. The figure was hunched over, its back arched at an unnatural angle. Its skin was pale, stretched thin over its bones, and its long, black hair hung limp around its face. The thing didn't move. It was as if it were waiting for me, watching me with its hollow eyes. I froze. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. My body refused to obey. Then, the thing whispered. At first, I couldn't make out the words. It was a low, guttural sound, like something was being dragged across the floor. But then I heard it clearly. "Help me." I felt my blood run cold. I took a step back, but my feet felt as if they were glued to the floor. The air was thick, heavy with an oppressive energy. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the figure. It slowly lifted its head, and I could see its face for the first time. Twisted, gaunt, with hollow, black eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. A smile curled on its lips, but it was a smile that didn't belong to any human. It was the grin of something ancient, something that had been twisted by darkness for centuries. "Help me," it repeated, its voice louder now, filled with pain. Without thinking, I took a step backward. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving me in pitch darkness. I heard a scraping sound, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, dragging footsteps. The figure was moving. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My legs were frozen, my body paralyzed with fear. I could feel the thing's presence growing stronger, its cold breath washing over me like ice. It wasn't just in front of me anymore. It was all around me, pressing in from all sides, suffocating me. "Leave," the figure rasped. "Leave before it's too late." And then, with a sudden surge of energy, I found my legs. I bolted for the door, my breath coming in frantic gasps, my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I ran all the way back to town, never once slowing down. I don't even remember the walk back, but when I finally reached the edge of the woods, I collapsed, gasping for air. The sun had set completely, and the town lay in darkness before me. I stumbled back to my apartment, my heart still racing, my mind in a state of disbelief. The next day, I went to the local library. I needed to know what had happened to me. The librarian, an older woman with gray hair and glasses, seemed hesitant when I asked about the church. But after a few minutes of prodding, she finally spoke. "People used to talk about the place," she said softly. "There were rumors of dark rituals, of things happening there that shouldn't have happened. The church was abandoned after the fire, but it was never completely gone. They say something evil, was sealed there, locked away." She told me that there were stories of people disappearing near the forest, and that many believed the land was cursed. Some even said that a demon had been summoned long ago, and it had attached itself to the church. No one had dared enter for decades, not since the fire that had burned most of it down. But it was still there, lingering in the ruins, waiting for someone like me to walk in. I didn't go back to the forest after that day. The nightmares, the feeling of being watched, the whispers in the dark, it was all too much. I moved out of Black Hollow soon after, and I never spoke about what happened to anyone else. Even now, I can't bring myself to return to that place. The memories of those hollow eyes, of the thing in the church, still haunt me. If you ever find yourself in Black Hollow, do yourself a favor. Stay far away from Black Hollow Forest. There are things that have been sealed there for a reason. things that should never be disturbed. I learned that the hard way, and I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, the cold presence that still lingers in the corners of my mind, even now. I used to think that possessions were just stories told around campfires, something that happened only in movies or to the unfortunate souls of distant towns. But all of that changed one night, when I witnessed something so terrifying that I'll never forget it as long as I live. It all started with Emily Gray, a sweet girl from the small town I grew up in. Emily was a typical teenager, friendly, bright, and full of life. She had a tight-knit group of friends, and they often spent time at her house after school. Her family wasn't particularly religious, but they were good, caring people. No one could have ever predicted the dark path Emily's life would take. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. Emily started acting distant, withdrawn, and exhausted. At first, her friends thought it was just stress from school. But then, things started to escalate. Emily's eyes would wander into the distance, her expressions becoming vacant, as though she were somewhere far away, lost in thought. Her voice would shake at times, and she'd make strange, unintelligible murmurs that no one could understand. Her best friend, Sarah, noticed the change the most. "Emily, you okay?" she would ask, but Emily's response was always the same. A slow shake of her head, followed by silence. Sarah tried to talk to her, but the more she did, the more distant Emily became. One afternoon, as Sarah and I were sitting in the living room at Emily's house, we noticed something strange. Emily was sitting on the couch, her head tilted back, staring up at the ceiling. We called her name, but she didn't respond. Concerned, Sarah stood up and gently shook her shoulder. "Emily? Emily, talk to me," Sarah said, her voice shaky. At first, there was no response, but then Emily's head snapped to the side, her eyes wide open. They were empty, dark and hollow. It wasn't her usual bright blue eyes. They were black, deep as the void. A cold, sinister laugh escaped from her lips, the sound completely alien to her kind, innocent nature. I felt my blood run cold, and Sarah froze, her face turning pale. "What the hell is happening to you?" Sarah whispered, her voice cracking with fear. Emily didn't answer. Instead, she stood up slowly, her movements stiff and unnatural. It was like she wasn't controlling her own body. Her mouth opened, and a voice, not her own, came out. It was guttural, inhuman, and it echoed in the room. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice hissed. "You shouldn't have awakened me." Neither Sarah nor I could move. It was as if we were paralyzed by fear. Emily's body began to convulse, shaking violently as though something inside her was trying to break free. We could hear bones cracking under the strain. Her skin stretched tight as if it didn't fit her anymore. It was like watching a horror movie in real life, except this was no movie. This was real. The voice that came from Emily's throat was deep, demonic, and it spoke in a language neither of us recognized. "I have waited for so long," it murmured. "Now, you will all join me." That's when I ran. I grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her toward the door. We didn't care that the door was locked. We didn't care about anything. All I knew was that whatever was inside Emily was not her anymore, and we had to get out. We didn't make it far. As we reached the front door, I felt a powerful force push against me, slamming me back into the room. I looked up in horror and saw Emily standing in the middle of the room. Her back arched unnaturally. The air felt heavy, suffocating, like a storm was about to break. The demonic presence inside her was palpable, thick with darkness. "I am Legion," the voice rasped, "and I will not be denied." I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I could barely breathe. The room grew colder by the second, and I could feel an oppressive weight on my chest. The force inside Emily was too strong for us to handle. In that moment, I realized we couldn't fight this on our own. "Please," Sarah cried, her voice pleading. "Please, Emily, come back." But Emily was gone. Whatever spirit or entity had taken control of her was too powerful, too ancient. It didn't want to leave. The air seemed to crackle with malice, and the shadows in the corners of the room began to stretch, like they were reaching for us. That's when we heard a knock at the door. At first, I didn't understand. Who would come to the door at a time like this? But then, I remembered Emily's father, Mark. He had been out of town, but I'd forgotten he was due back that evening. I rushed to the door, trembling. My hand hovered over the handle, but as I reached for it, I felt an intense surge of energy rip through me. The air crackled again, and I knew something had changed. Emily's father was standing there, his face pale and drawn, his eyes wide with concern. "What's happening?" he demanded, stepping inside without waiting for me to speak. Before I could answer, Emily turned toward him. The blackness in her eyes deepened, and she hissed, the voice inside her louder than ever before. "You are too late," it snarled. "You cannot save her." Mark's face twisted in horror, and for a split second, I saw recognition in his eyes. He knew what was happening. He had seen this before. He turned to me, his expression filled with a kind of hopelessness. "I tried to stop it," he said, his voice breaking. "I thought I could protect her, but it was too strong. She called it, and now it's here." With those words, I realized Emily's father wasn't just a worried parent. He knew about the dark forces that plagued their family. But even he was powerless against what had taken over his daughter. "Please, help her," I whispered, not knowing what else to say. Mark stepped forward, his hands trembling. He mumbled something under his breath, a prayer of some sort, but it was drowned out by the demonic laughter that filled the room. Emily's body jerked violently again, her head twisting in ways it shouldn't. It was as if she were being pulled apart from the inside. Mark stepped forward and reached out to her. "Emily," he said, his voice full of pain. "Emily, I'm sorry. Please, fight it. You can fight it." For a moment, I thought I saw something. Her, the real Emily. Her eyes flickered, the blackness momentarily retreating, and she gasped for air. "Dad," she whispered, her voice weak. "Please, help me." But before Mark could respond, the demon inside her roared in anger. The room seemed to tremble, and the lights flickered wildly. It wasn't Emily speaking anymore. It was the demon, its voice full of rage. "She is mine," it screamed. "She belongs to me now." I watched in horror as Mark collapsed to his knees, tears streaming down his face. His daughter was lost to him. The air grew heavier, the darkness suffocating. The only sound was the growling voice of the demon, the cracks of lightning flashing in the distance, and Emily's ragged breathing. But then, something happened. The door slammed open, and a figure stepped into the room. An old priest, his face worn with age but full of authority. He was a tall man, draped in a black robe, his eyes sharp with purpose. Without a word, he moved past us and approached Emily, who stood there, trembling, her body twisted in agony. He raised his hands, and with a voice so powerful, it could have shaken the heavens, he uttered words in Latin. The demon inside Emily screeched, its voice writhing in pain as the priest's chant filled the room. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of Emily's face, her real face, before it was replaced by the twisted, monstrous one again. The priest continued his exorcism, his words cutting through the darkness. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows receding as the power of the demon waned. And then, with a final scream, the darkness left Emily's body. She collapsed onto the floor, her body limp, her eyes fluttering closed. The air in the room lightened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, we could breathe again. Mark rushed to her side, cradling his daughter in his arms, tears of relief streaming down his face. She was weak, but alive. The priest stood silently, his eyes dark and solemn. He didn't speak at first, but after a long pause, he finally turned to us. "She was marked," he said quietly. "This curse was not of her making. Someone invited it in, and now it's gone." But even though the demon had been driven out, I knew that Emily's life would never be the same. The scars of possession would always remain, lingering in the shadows of her mind. As for me, I learned a valuable lesson that night. Demons don't just possess bodies. They possess souls, families, and everything we hold dear. And sometimes, they leave a mark that can never truly be erased. I didn't believe in demons. Not really. I grew up in a quiet suburban neighborhood where the most terrifying things were school tests and bad grades. The idea of demons and possession seemed like something out of a movie, something exaggerated to make people afraid of the unknown. But that all changed when I moved into the Winterwood house. I had just graduated high school and was looking for a fresh start. I wanted a place where I could be alone, away from the pressures of my old life. I had heard about the Winterwood house from a local realtor who mentioned it was a bit old and had been vacant for a while. He didn't mention anything strange about the house, just that it had a fair price for someone looking to start over. And, honestly, I wasn't too concerned about its past. The house was situated on the outskirts of town, surrounded by tall trees and thick woods. It looked peaceful at first, a two-story building with ivy creeping up the walls, giving it a rustic charm. The windows were large, allowing plenty of light to pour into the rooms. There were no other houses nearby, and I could already imagine the quiet nights spent reading or watching movies. It seemed perfect. The first few days were calm. I spent my time unpacking, setting up furniture, and cleaning. There was an old fireplace in the living room, which I thought would add to the coziness of the place. It was everything I had hoped for, but something felt off. It wasn't a feeling I could explain, not right away. It was like there was a presence in the house, something that wasn't quite visible, but always just beyond my perception. It began with the whispers. At night, when the house was completely silent, I would hear faint voices coming from somewhere deep inside the walls. At first, I assumed it was the old pipes or the house settling, but the sounds didn't follow a natural rhythm. It was like a murmur, a voice speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just my imagination. After all, I was alone, and it wasn't unusual for old houses to creak and groan. But as time passed, the whispers grew louder. They started to come from different corners of the house, and I couldn't escape them. The sounds followed me wherever I went. In the middle of the night, when I would wake up, I would hear it, the soft murmur, like someone was right outside my door, whispering my name. I'd sit up in bed, my heart pounding, but when I opened the door, there was nothing. No one. Then came the dreams. They weren't ordinary dreams. They were vivid, twisted, and disturbing. Each night, I would find myself in the same dark, cold place, an empty room with cracked stone walls. There was always a figure in the corner, hidden in the shadows, watching me. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, burning through my skin. It would stand there, waiting, until I approached it. Then, I would hear it speak, low, growling words in a language that made my skin crawl. I tried to scream, but no sound would come out. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I woke up every time in a cold sweat, my heart racing, terrified. But no matter how many times I woke up, I would fall asleep again, only to return to that same room, to the same figure. It was on the seventh night that I woke up to something I couldn't explain. I had been lying in bed, trying to shake off the nightmares, when I heard it. The whispering, louder this time, coming from downstairs. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The noise wasn't from the pipes or the wind. It sounded like chanting, a deep, guttural voice calling out over and over again. The words were still in that same language, but this time they were clearer, more deliberate. It was as though someone, or something, was performing some kind of ritual. Fear gripped me, but I couldn't just sit there. I had to know what was going on. I grabbed my flashlight and crept down the stairs, my breath shallow, my body trembling. The living room was dark, and the house felt colder than it ever had before. I stood there for a moment, listening, before I made my way toward the basement door. The whispers were coming from there. I don't know what possessed me to open it. Maybe it was the need for answers, or maybe I was already so terrified that I had nothing left to lose. But I opened that door, and as soon as I stepped into the basement, I felt it, the oppressive weight in the air, pressing down on me. The basement was pitch black, but the air was thick with an unnatural chill. I could barely make out the outlines of old furniture and boxes in the corner. The floor was covered with a layer of dust, untouched for years. But it wasn't the dust or the darkness that made my heart race. It was the presence, that feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to do something. I felt trapped, as if the very walls of the house were closing in around me. And then I saw it. In the farthest corner of the basement, there was a figure, tall, dark, and cloaked in shadows. At first, I thought it was just an illusion, a trick of the light. But as I focused, I saw its form clearly. Its twisted, inhuman face, covered with scars, its eyes glowing an unnatural red. It was smiling, its teeth sharp and yellowed, but the smile was wrong. It was a predator's smile. I tried to scream, but the air around me thickened, and the sound was muffled. The figure began to move, its long, bony fingers outstretched toward me. The whispers grew louder, chanting the same eerie words over and over again. The temperature dropped so low that I could see my breath in front of me. It was like the very air in the room was alive, writhing with an energy that I couldn't comprehend. In that moment, I felt a presence inside me, pulling at my very soul. I wanted to run, to escape, but I couldn't. It was like the house had taken hold of me, like it was feeding off my fear. My limbs were frozen, unable to move. And then, I heard the voice I had been hearing in my dreams, but now, it was right in front of me. Leave, or be mine. The voice growled, deep and menacing. I couldn't fight it. I couldn't move. But just as I thought I would be consumed by whatever force had taken over the house, I heard a loud banging sound, like a door slamming open, and the figure in front of me disappeared. The presence lifted. The air lightened. I could move again. I turned, frantic, and saw someone standing in the doorway of the basement, the local priest, Father Thomas. I had never met him before, but in that moment, I knew exactly who he was. He was the only one who could help. "Get out of here," he shouted, his voice firm but filled with urgency. Now, without thinking, I turned and bolted up the stairs. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel the house itself trying to hold me, but Father Thomas's presence gave me enough strength to escape. The next few days were a blur. Father Thomas took me in, and I didn't go back to the Winterwood house. I found out later that the house had a dark history. It had once belonged to a family that dabbled in dark rituals, trying to summon something from beyond this world. They had succeeded, but the price was high. The house had become a conduit, a gateway for dark spirits, feeding off anyone who stepped inside. Father Thomas performed an exorcism on the house, but I knew the truth. Some things, once they are unleashed, can never be fully contained. The Winterwood house was still standing, still waiting for someone to come along and open its door again. And me? I'll never forget what I felt that night. I can still hear the whispers, the chanting, the growl of the demon calling me to join it. And I know that no matter where I go, it will always be there, lurking in the dark corners of my mind, waiting for me to return. Some houses are more than just buildings. Some houses are alive. And the Winterwood house was one of them. There are moments in life that you never forget. A fleeting glance, an unexpected conversation, or a particular event that seems to linger with you forever. But then, there are the moments that change you. The moments when something so unnatural, so horrific, happens that it leaves a permanent scar on your soul. I was 15 when I encountered something that I can never explain. Something that left me questioning everything I knew about reality. It all started on a cold autumn evening when my family moved into the old Harrow's house. The Harrow's house wasn't exactly what you'd call a welcoming place. It stood at the edge of our small town, almost abandoned, with broken windows and a yard overrun by weeds. It had been empty for years, and no one had ever really talked about it much. It was just there. When my parents decided we'd move into it, they never mentioned any history behind it. Nothing about the previous owners or why it had been left vacant. I didn't think much of it at first. Sure, the house had its quirks, like the creaky floorboards and the strange smell that never quite went away. But that didn't scare me. Not at first. The first sign that something was wrong came within the first few days. It was late in the evening, and I had just finished unpacking my room. I was sitting on the bed, reading, when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my room. I paused, listening carefully, and waited for the sound to stop. But it didn't. The footsteps grew louder, closer, as if someone was pacing right outside the door. I assumed it was my younger brother, Jake, trying to sneak around the house. But when I opened the door, there was no one there. I checked the hallway, empty. I brushed it off as my imagination playing tricks on me, chalking it up to the house being old and settling. But the unease stayed with me. It wasn't just the sound of footsteps. It was the feeling that something was watching me, something invisible yet present. A few days later, things took a darker turn. It was a Friday night, and my parents had gone out for dinner, leaving me and Jake alone in the house. The wind was howling outside, and the trees scraped against the windows, making everything feel even more ominous. Jake and I were sitting on the couch, watching TV, when the lights flickered. I thought it was just the storm, but then the power went out entirely. We sat in the dark for a few moments, trying to adjust to the sudden silence. I could hear Jake breathing beside me, but something else was there, something I couldn't place. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. "I'm going to check the fuse box," I told Jake, my voice shaking. I stood up and made my way down the hall, passing by the rooms. That's when I heard it again, the soft, shuffling footsteps. Only this time, they were following me. My heart began to race as I quickened my pace, but no matter how fast I moved, the footsteps stayed right behind me. I reached the fuse box and opened it, but when I flicked the switch, the power didn't come back on. The house remained in total darkness. Then, I heard a whisper, a voice, low and hoarse, just behind me. It wasn't Jake's voice. It wasn't anyone I recognized. "Leave," the voice growled, its tone menacing and full of malice. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the empty, shadow-filled hallway. "Jake?" I called, my voice cracking. There was no answer. I rushed back to the living room, but when I opened the door, I froze. Jake was sitting on the couch, staring at the television screen, his face pale. His eyes were wide open, but he didn't seem to notice me at all. "Jake?" I called again, but there was no response. His body was stiff, unmoving. The air felt colder, and that suffocating presence I had felt earlier seemed to grow stronger. Slowly, I walked toward him, my footsteps echoing in the stillness of the house. When I reached him, I gently touched his shoulder. Suddenly, his head jerked to the side, and his eyes locked onto mine. But they weren't Jake's eyes. They were dark, completely black, like two empty voids. His mouth opened, but it wasn't his voice that spoke. "You will all fall one by one." I jumped back, my heart racing as I stared at him. His face twisted into a grin, an unnatural, horrific grin. It wasn't Jake anymore. It couldn't be. It was as if something else had taken over his body. Something dark, something ancient. Before I could react, the door slammed shut, trapping me in the room with him. Jake? No, whatever it was that had taken over his body, stood up, his movements jerky and unnatural. He reached out toward me, his hands stretching, his grin widening. "Join me," it whispered. Its voice now a mixture of Jake's voice and something else, something deep and primal. I backed away, my breath quick and shallow, but I couldn't escape. I was trapped in the dark room with that thing. I don't know how much time passed, but in that moment, I realized that I wasn't just dealing with some prank. This wasn't just my brother playing a joke. Whatever was in him wasn't human. It was something far worse. It was then that I remembered the stories I'd heard from the neighbors, the ones who had lived in the house before us. They talked about the strange occurrences that had plagued the property. People had disappeared, only to be found weeks later, their bodies cold and unrecognizable. The previous owners had left the house in a hurry, abandoning everything behind, leaving only rumors and whispers about dark forces that had been awakened in the house. But no one had told us any of this when we moved in. No one had warned us. I had to do something, anything to get my brother back. I couldn't let this evil take him, not like this. I knew I couldn't fight it on my own. I ran to the phone, but the lines were dead. The house seemed to have swallowed every ounce of light, every bit of hope. I was alone with whatever had taken hold of Jake. In desperation, I ran upstairs to our parents' room, hoping to find something that might help. That's when I saw it, a book on the nightstand. It was old and worn, the cover tattered, but the title was clear. The Rite of Exorcism. My heart leaped in my chest. It was exactly what I needed. I grabbed the book and rushed back down to the living room. Jake, or whatever was inside him, was still standing there, watching me with those black, empty eyes. He didn't move, but I could feel the malevolent presence pressing in on me. I opened the book, my hands shaking, and started to read aloud the words that I hoped would drive the demon out. At first, there was no change. The air grew colder, but nothing happened. Then, as I spoke louder, the temperature dropped even more. I could see my breath in the air, fogging up in front of me. Jake's body twitched, jerking as if struggling against something inside him. And then, something happened that I'll never forget. A voice, deeper and more powerful than the one I had heard before, rose from Jake's throat. It was a roar, a guttural, otherworldly scream that shook the walls of the house. The lights flickered back on, and for a moment, I could see Jake's face contorted in pain. "Leave, now!" the voice boomed, shaking the entire room. I didn't stop. I kept reading, the words flowing from my mouth like a chant. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the room went completely still. Jake collapsed to the floor, his eyes returning to normal, the blackness vanishing. His body was limp, his breathing shallow. I rushed to him, my hands trembling as I checked for signs of life. He was still alive. For the next few days, things were quiet. My parents arrived home later that night, and we never spoke about what happened. But I knew the truth. Whatever had taken over my brother was still out there, waiting. And even though we had driven it out of our home for now, I knew we hadn't seen the last of it. The Harrows house was not just a house. It was a gateway, a place where dark things lurked in the shadows, feeding on fear and souls. And even though we left it behind, the memory of that night will always haunt me. I learned one painful truth. Some doors should never be opened, and some spirits should never be disturbed. Because once they are, they'll never truly leave you.